The cabin door exploded inward. Snow and gunfire tore through the gap in the same breath. A man already down on the floorboards did not reach for his rifle. He only watched the shadow filling the doorway, the one still standing between the storm and the woman claiming it in the hearth weeks earlier. Outside, the blizzard erased the valley. Inside, the fire still burned, the same fire that once warmed a stranger who walked out of the white and dropped her pack without asking permission. A third set of hooves closed the distance through the howling dark. The knife in her hand caught the light. The rifle in the doorway rose one last time. He did not move. The axe came down, split the log clean. Emmett Calloway did not flinch at the sound anymore. Used to. Back when every sharp crack made him duck, made his shoulders curl toward his ears like a man still waiting for a rifle report to follow. Not anymore. 4 years of solitude will do that to a man. Grind the flinch right out of him. Leave something else behind. Something quieter. Something worse, maybe. He set another log on the stump, split it, set another. Arizona Territory in December did not forgive laziness. The valley held its cold the way a grudge holds a man's chest, tight, low, permanent. Emmett's breath came out in gray ribbons that the wind snatched and tore apart before they'd even finished forming. His hands were cracked at the knuckles. He didn't notice that either, not anymore. Because noticing things led to thinking about things, and thinking about things led to Rose. He split another log. The cabin behind him sat low and gray against the hillside, smoke curling thin from the chimney, one window glowing faint orange from the banked fire inside. It had been Rose's cabin. Her hands had hung the curtains that didn't exist anymore. Her voice had filled rooms that now held only the sound of his own boots on the floorboards and the occasional creak of settling wood, which some nights, in the worst hours, sounded almost like breathing, almost like someone else was there. Nobody was there. That was the arrangement. That was the whole arrangement, actually. Nobody there. Nobody to leave, nobody to bury. He'd buried enough. Emmett straightened, pressed a hand into his lower back, looked west where the sky had gone, the color of a day-old bruise. Purple bleeding into gray, bleeding into something almost black at the horizon line. Storm coming. A big one. He could feel it in the ache behind his left knee. An old injury from a fall-off, a spooked gelding some winter he could no longer place with any confidence. Everything blurred together out here. Winters especially. Except this one he would remember. Though he didn't know that yet. Couldn't have known it, standing there with an axe in his hand and frost forming on his mustache, watching the last gray light drain out of a sky that was about to change everything. He gathered the split wood into the crook of his arm, carried it inside. The cabin held the smell it always held. Wood smoke, leather, the faint mineral tang of the well water he boiled for coffee. He'd built the place himself 4 years back, before he understood what building a home actually meant. Before he understood that a home wasn't logs and mud chinking and a good tight roof. A home was the people who filled the silence between the logs. And when the people left, when Rose left, when the fever took her quiet and quick during the one winter he'd been away scouting for the army pack. The one winter he swore he'd never forgive himself for missing the logs and the chinking and the roof remained. But the home did not. He stacked the wood by the hearth, fed 2 logs into the low fire, watched the flames climb them, orange tongues licking bark, and for a moment, just a moment, he let himself remember her hands, the way she used to reach past him to add wood herself. Because she said he always put too much on at once, never trusted the fire to breathe. "You're smothering it," she'd say. He could still hear her voice saying it, which was strange, because he could no longer remember the exact color of her eyes. Some days that scared him more than anything else out here in the dark, that a man could lose the color of his wife's eyes, but keep the exact cadence of her scolding, word for word, forever. Because grief didn't work the way people said it would, didn't fade evenly. Took pieces of a person and kept some, discarded others, and there was no telling which would go first. He straightened up, rubbed his palms together over the fire. Outside, the wind picked up. He heard it find the corner of the cabin and worry at it the way a dog worries at a bone it can't quite crack open. A low moan through the chinking. He'd need to check the horse. Check the woodpile was covered. Check the shutters were latched tight, because this storm had teeth. He could feel it now and more than his knee feel it, in the pressure behind his eyes, in the stillness that had come over the valley in the last hour, a stillness that wasn't peace, was warning. He pulled his coat back on, stepped into weather that had already begun to sparkle flakes sideways, stinging where they hit exposed skin. The horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Duke, stamped and blew when Emmett entered the lean-to, ears pinned back. Nervous. Animals always knew first. Easy, Emmett said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse. He didn't talk much these days. Didn't have cause to. He checked the water trough hadn't frozen solid yet, threw an extra flake of hay. Made sure the lean-to's north wall, the weak one, the one he kept meaning to reinforce and never did, was holding against the wind that was already screaming down off the ridge with a violence that made the pines groan. By the time he made it back to the cabin, the light was gone entirely. Full dark, though it wasn't much past 4 in the afternoon. Winter did that out here. Stole the day early, and gave it back grudgingly, if at all. He barred the door, sat by the fire, ate cold biscuit and jerky because he couldn't be bothered to cook, not with the storm howling like something alive outside, something with claws testing the seams of his roof. And he thought, as he often thought on nights like this, that he had built himself a very good coffin. Warm, dry, solid. Just missing the part where somebody mourned him. He didn't finish that thought. Didn't let himself. Poured another finger of the whiskey he rationed carefully, because a man alone with a bottle and a blizzard was a man asking for trouble, and Emmett Calloway had learned the hard way, the only way he seemed capable of learning anything, not to ask for trouble twice in one lifetime. The fire popped. Outside, the storm found its full voice, and somewhere in that voice, buried though deep he almost didn't catch it, was something else, something that didn't belong to wind. He sat up straighter, listened. Nothing. Just the storm, doing what storms did. He told himself that, settled back, closed his eyes until it came again. A sound, small, deliberate. 3 knocks, spaced evenly, the kind of knocking that wasn't the wind slapping a loose shutter, wasn't a branch, wasn't anything except a human hand asking politely, urgently to be let in from the kind of cold that killed. Emmett was on his feet before he'd finished thinking about it. Hand on the rifle, propped by the door out of old habit, the habit of a man who'd scouted enough Apache country to know that isolated cabins in storms were exactly the kind of place trouble liked to knock. "Who's there?" he called. Not a question. A demand. Just another knock. Softer this time, like whoever stood on the other side of that door was running out of strength to make the sound at all. He lifted the bar, opened the door 3 inches, rifle angled through the gap, and the storm poured in around a woman. She stood on his threshold, soaked through, black hair plastered flat against her skull, a bundle clutched against her chest like it was the only warm thing left in the world. Her lips had gone the color of old bruises, but her eyes were sharp, alert. Not the eyes of someone begging, the eyes of someone assessing, cataloging him the way he'd have cataloged a threat. "You going to shoot me?" she said. Not a question either. Exhausted, daring him to answer wrong. "Or you going to let the cold in and shut the door?" He didn't move for 1 full second. Long enough that snow gusted past her into his cabin, melting instantly on the warm floorboards. Then he stepped back, lowered the rifle. Let her in. She didn't wait for an invitation twice. Walked straight to the fire like she owned it. Dropped to her knees in front of the flames and held out both hands, shaking so hard he could hear her teeth clatter from across the room. Emmett shut the door, bared it again. Stood there a moment with his back against it, watching a stranger warm herself at his hearth, trying to work out exactly which part of this evening had gone so completely off the rails and when. "There's a blanket," he said finally, gestured toward the trunk near the bed. "Take it." She didn't look up. Already found it. He looked. She had. Draped it over her own shoulders without asking, without waiting, the two moving through his cabin like she'd already decided this was, temporarily at least, hers too. He should have found that infuriating. He mostly found it interesting, which unsettled him more than the infuriating would have. You got a name," he said, Guyan. She said it without looking at him, eyes on the fire, jaw tight against the shivering, white mountain. Apache. He'd guessed as much from her dress, from the moccasins soaked through, from the careful, deliberate way she'd assessed him at the door, like a woman who'd learned the hard way that strangers were rarely safe. He kept his face still. Didn't let the recognition show. Didn't let anything show, because that was a skill he'd built over years of scouting, of sitting across campfires from men who wanted him dead and needing them not to know it. "Emmett Calloway," he offered. Because it seemed only fair, she nodded. Didn't repeat it. Didn't need to. He got the sense She'd remember it anyway, filed away with everything else she was cataloging in that sharp, assessing gaze of hers. The fire crackled. The storm screamed against the shutters. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything else, the silence stretching thin and strange between two strangers and one small fire in the middle of a mountain, in the middle of a blizzard. Then she spoke, and the words came out flat. Rehearsed almost, like she'd turned them over 100 times on the walk, here, sharpening them the way a woman sharpens a knife. Before she needs it. You need a wife, she said, and I need a roof. Emmett blinked. Come again. You heard me. She finally looked up at him. Firelight caught the sharp planes of her face, the exhaustion under her eyes, and underneath the exhaustion, something harder. Something that had survived things he probably didn't want to ask about. This cabin. One man living in it. No woman's things anywhere. No woman's cooking smell. You're alone, and you've been alone a long while, and a man alone out here doesn't survive one bad winter if he gets sick or hurt, and we both know it. That's not, and I need somewhere the wind doesn't find me, she went on, riding straight over him. Somewhere with a roof that doesn't leak and a fire that doesn't go out, and a man who can shoot straight if trouble comes calling. I can cook. I can hunt. I know medicine, real medicine, not the kind your army surgeons peddle. I can keep a house better than you've kept this one, and I mean no insult by that. I mean it as fact. She let that sit. Let him look around at the dust on the shelves, the single unwashed plate, the general gray sameness of a house that had stopped being lived in and started merely being occupied. You've got a hole in your sock, she added, glancing at his feet. Both socks, actually. It's not part of this conversation. It's evidence. I'm building a case. Against what? Against the idea you're managing just fine on your own. She crossed her arms. Man managing fine doesn't have holes in both socks and rot in his cellar, and a fence post about to fall over the first hard wind. You've been here 5 minutes. Didn't need longer than 5 minutes. Her chin lifted, daring him to argue the point. I've got eyes. You've got opinions. Same thing, mostly, in a woman who's kept herself alive this long. Something almost like humor moved behind her exhaustion, quick and sharp. You want to keep arguing about my socks assessment, or you want to hear the rest of the offer. Didn't realize there was a rest. There's always a rest. She held up a hand, counting off on cold, stiffened fingers. Cooking. Mending. Doctoring better than any army surgeon you'd find inside 2 days' ride. Hunting when you're not too proud to let a woman carry half the meat home. And I don't complain. Which, from what I can already tell, standing in this room 5 minutes, is going to be the rarest gift you've had under this roof in longer than you'd care to admit. I'm not proud. Everybody says that. Nobody means it. I mean it, we'll see. She said it, like a verdict, not an agreement, and something about the flatness of it needled him more than an outright argument would have. I'm not asking for charity, she said. I'm offering a trade. Fair, even. You give me a roof. I give you a wife's work. That's all. Nothing more than that unless we both decide otherwise. And even then, that's our business and nobody else's. She dropped her bundle beside the hearth, let it land with a soft final thud, the gesture of a woman who had made her decision 3 miles back through the snow and would not be talked out of it now. Emmett stared at her. You don't know a thing about me, he said. I know you didn't shoot me at the door. Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. That's more than most men out here would have managed. That's a low bar. It's the only bar that's mattered to me in 3 years. Something flickered behind her eyes when she said it, gone before he could read it properly so. Do we have an arrangement, Emmett Calloway, or do I take my chances back out in that? She tilted her head toward the door, towards the storm still howling like something starved. You'd walk back out into that, he said, not quite believing it, rather than wait for a proper answer. I've walked out into worse than a snowstorm to get away from a bad answer. She said it plain, no drama in it, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted it. So, which is it? He knew what waited out there. Knew exactly how long a person lasted in a whiteout like this one, soaked through, exhausted, with no shelter for miles. Knew it wasn't a real choice at all. Not really. And she knew it too. And they both stood there in the firelight pretending, otherwise for the length of one long breath. A few days, he said finally. Because some things a man couldn't say no to and still call himself a man. Storm passes. We'll see. We'll see, she repeated. Neutral, non-committal, but something in her shoulders loosened just slightly, like she'd been braced for a different answer and hadn't quite believed she wouldn't get it. She turned back to the fire, held her hands out to it again. There's a rule. Who's? He added, because it seemed important to say it now, before the silence swallowed the chance. You sleep by the fire, I sleep in the bed. Nothing more to it than that, unless we both say different later, out loud. Plain. Plain suits me. She glanced at him sideways. You always this careful about saying things out loud. I've learned to be. She didn't ask what had taught him that. He didn't ask what had taught her to demand it stated plain in the first place. Two guarded people, laying down the first small brick of an arrangement, neither of them fully trusted yet. And Emmett Calloway stood in the middle of his own cabin, watching a stranger claim his hearth, thinking that whatever this storm had blown in through his door, it wasn't leaving quietly. It wasn't leaving quietly at all. The first night, neither of them slept much. She took the spot nearest the fire without asking which. Emmett was learning fast. Seemed to be her general approach to most things wrapped in the blanket. Back to the flames, facing the door. Facing the door. He noticed that. Tucked it away with everything else. He'd already started cataloging about her since the threshold. A person who slept facing the door was a person who'd learned, somewhere, sometime, that backs were not safe to turn. He took the bed. Didn't sleep either. Lay there listening to the storm and to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in his cabin, a sound he hadn't heard in 4 years, and found it stranger than the storm itself. Because sound like that pulled memory up, whether he wanted it or not. Pulled up the last night he'd heard Rose breathing in this same room, this same bed, before he'd ridden out at first light, on orders that couldn't wait. 6 weeks of scouting ahead of him, and a wife who'd kissed him at the door and told him not to worry, told him she'd be fine, told him the way people always told each other, right before the worst thing happened. He remembered the ride out clear as glass. Remembered less clearly the 6 weeks themselves, blurred now into a single gray smear of cold camps and longer trails, and a growing unease he couldn't name at the time and understood, later, had been some animal part of him already knowing. What he remembered with terrible precision was the ride back. The smoke from his own chimney, thin and wrong, banked too low for a woman who kept her fires generous. The silence when he opened the door. Rose's sister sitting by the cold hearth with her hands folded and her face already arranged into the shape grief makes a face take, and the words that came after that he still, 4 years on, could not make himself think all the way through, without his chest closing up like a fist. Gone 6 days. Fever took her fast, her sister said. Called for him near the end. Called his name into a cabin that had nobody in it but a sister who couldn't do anything except hold her hand and watch. He hadn't been there. That was the whole of it. That was the fact that sat at the bottom of everything, under the whiskey rationing and the solitude and the years of splitting wood until his hands cracked, because splitting wood didn't leave room for thinking, and thinking led here, always here, to a cabin with a cold hearth and a woman calling a name nobody answered. He lay in the dark now, 4 years later, listening to a different woman breathe by a fire that wasn't cold, and understood with the same cold clarity that had greeted him at his own front door that terrible day, that some part of him had been waiting, this whole time, for a reason to feel something other than guilt in this cabin. He didn't know yet if that was what this was. He only knew it was the first time in 4 years the silence hadn't felt entirely like punishment. By morning, the wind had settled into something merely brutal instead of murderous. Gray light seeped through the shutters. Emmett Rose's first old habit, and found her already awake, already sitting up, already watching him, with those sharp assessing eyes, like she'd been waiting to see what kind of man he'd be, once the dark burned off, and the decisions of the night before had to survive daylight. Coffee, he said, because it seemed like the thing to say. You have any? Some. Good beans or the burnt army kind you men drink out here. Does it matter? It matters. She was up now, folding the blanket with brisk, efficient movements, and he noticed, because apparently he noticed everything about her now, some switch in him flipped on and refusing to flip back off, that she moved like someone accustomed to small spaces, holding more people than they were built for. Economical, no wasted motion. He made the coffee. Burnt kind. She drank it, made a face. Burnt. She drank it, firmed. Told you it didn't matter. Didn't said I'd drink it anyway. She set the cup down. There's a difference. You'll learn it, will I? You will if you're staying stubborn about everything else. A ghost of something crossed her mouth, not quite a smile, gone before he could be sure he'd seen it at all. I'll need the trap blinds, she said, once the cup was empty. Where you've set them. What's caught what? And I'll need to know if there's a smokehouse, because if there isn't, we're building one before the ground freezes any harder than it already has. You've got one man's worth of meat put by for a winter that's already showing its teeth early. She said it without heat. Just fact, the way she seemed to say most things. That's not going to feed two people through until spring. So, trap lines, smokehouse, and I'll want to see what you're calling a root cellar, because from the smell in here, something's already going soft down there. He opened his mouth to argue, found somewhat to his own irritation that he had nothing to argue with. She was right. He'd been provisioning for one for 4 years, had gotten complacent about it, had let the margins get thin because thin margins didn't matter much to a man who mostly wanted the winter to be over quickly, regardless of how it went. Root cellars out back, he said instead. Lines start at the creek, show me. And that was how the first full day went. Her walking his land like she was inspecting a purchase she wasn't yet sure she'd made, asking sharp questions, noting things he'd let slide, a fence post rotting at the base, a trap set wrong and likely to lose more game than it caught, a root cellar that did, in fact, have something going soft in the back corner that he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks, because dealing with it meant admitting how far he'd let things drift. This trap, she said, crouching over it, you said it wrong. I've been setting traps since before you were walking. Then you learned it wrong a long time ago and nobody's corrected you since. She reset it herself, fast, sure hands. There. Now it'll actually catch something instead of announcing you're coming from 30 feet off. He watched her do it, wanted to be annoyed. Found instead that he was taking notes. By afternoon she'd fixed the trap. By evening she'd found and disposed of the rotten potatoes and reorganized the cellar with a ruthless efficiency that left him standing in the doorway, feeling absurdly like a guest in his own home. You always this particular? He asked, watching her. I always this alive, she said. Didn't look up from what she was doing. There's a difference between surviving and being careless about surviving. I don't have room left in my life for careless. Something in the way she said it flat, worn smooth by repetition, like a stone rubbed down by a river that had carried it a very long way, made him want to ask what she meant, what had taught her that particular lesson and when and how hard. He didn't ask. Some doors he understood, you didn't knock on uninvited. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He of all people understood that. The second day brought their first real argument, and it came, of all things, over a rabbit. He'd shot it clean at 40 yards, brought it in proud of the shot, and she'd taken one look and shaken her head. You gutted it wrong. I've gutted 1,000 rabbits, and apparently learned nothing from any of them. She took the knife from his hand, just took it, no asking, the same way she'd claimed the fire that first night, and showed him, fast and economical, exactly where he'd been wasting good meat for years without knowing it. There, she said. Now you've got supper instead of half a supper and a mess. I was doing fine before you got here. You were doing. She handed the knife back. Handle first. Fine's a generous word for it. You always this insulting to the man whose roof you're using. You always this thin-skinned about a rabbit. Her mouth curved. Finally, something close to real amusement breaking through the guard she kept up. I've met porcupines, took criticism better than you, Emmett Calloway. I don't recall inviting your opinion on my gutting technique. Didn't ask. Offered. She turned back to the fire, already dismissing him, already moving on to the next task, and he stood there holding a badly gutted rabbit and a knife, and feeling, against every instinct he had, the corner of his own mouth twitch upward. He caught it before it became a full smile. Mostly. Almost. She saw it anyway. He knew she saw it because something in her shoulders eased when she saw it, some small victory noted and tucked away the same careful way she kept track of everything else. Neither of them said anything more about it. But supper that night tasted better than any meal had in 4 years. And Emmett couldn't have said whether that was her cooking or something else entirely, something he wasn't ready to put a name to yet. On the third day she asked to come with him on the hunt. He almost said no. Old habit. Hunting was solitary work, had been solitary work for 4 years, and the idea of sharing it felt, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, more intimate than sharing the cabin itself. You'll slow me down, he said instead, which was a lie and a poor one, and she knew it. Try me. She did not slow him down. They went out before light, breath clouding, boots crunching frost-hard ground, and within the first hour he understood he'd been wrong about her in ways that went beyond simple competence. She read sign he'd have missed. A disturbed patch of brush he'd have walked straight past. She crouched over, fingers light against broken stems, and told him, flat and certain, mule deer. Two of them moved through before dawn, heading toward the water. How do you know it's two? Because there's two different depths to the tracks. She didn't look up. One's heavier. Buck, probably. You want me to draw you a picture, you want to follow the sign. Follow the sign, he said, bit back the urge to smile. Didn't quite manage it. She caught it anyway. Always caught it. They tracked the deer for the better part of 2 hours, moving quiet, moving careful, and somewhere in that quiet a rhythm developed between them that surprised him with how naturally it came, her reading ground sign, him reading wind and light, each of them filling gaps the other left, without needing to be told where the gaps were. You move quiet for a big man, she said at one point, with barely a whisper. Scout training, good training. A pause. Better than most white men I've tracked with. You've tracked with a lot of white men. Enough to know most of them sound like a wagon full of pots falling down a hill. She glanced back at him, something almost warm in it. You're not that. High praise. Don't let it go to your head. He took the shot when it came, clean, and she was the one who moved in fast and sure to make certain of the kill and start the field dressing before the cold set the meat wrong. Her hands quick and practiced in a way that told him this wasn't new work for her. Hadn't ever been new work. Not since she was small enough that somebody had to have taught her. Your mother teach you this? He asked, before he'd thought better of asking it. Her hands didn't stop moving, but something in her face closed, just slightly, a door easing shut without slamming. My mother taught me plenty of things, she said. This was one of the easier ones. He let it be. Didn't push. Same rule as always, the one they were building together, without ever naming it, small truths first, offered freely. The big ones, when they came, would come on their own schedule, not his. They carried the deer back together, the physical work of it forcing them into a closeness neither had quite bargained for, shoulders brushing under the shared weight, breath synchronizing without either one trying to make it so. By the time they reached the cabin, the light was already failing, and Emmett realized, with a small internal jolt, that the day had gone by faster than any day had gone by, in longer than he wanted to count. Good hunt, he said, once the meat was hung and the light was fully gone. Good hunt, she agreed. And then, quieter, almost to herself, been a long while since I had one of those with somebody instead of alone. He didn't have an answer for that. Didn't need one, maybe. Some things just needed saying out loud once, into the dark, so both people knew the other had heard it. The days that followed found their own rhythm. Awkward, at first, then less so. She cooked food that tasted different from anything he'd made himself. Unfamiliar spices, away with the wild game that made even the tough winter meat come out tender. He caught himself twice, actually looking forward to supper, which felt like a betrayal of something, though he couldn't have said what, or to whom. She kept the fire differently than he did, fed it in smaller increments more often, the way he realized with a jolt that landed somewhere behind his ribs Rose used to. He didn't tell her that. Didn't know how he'd even begin to say it. They argued about small things. The proper way to smoke venison. Whether the horse needed a second blanket at night. She thought he coddled the animal. He thought she underestimated how cold Arizona could get once you climbed high enough into these hills. Cold enough to kill livestock that hadn't been properly prepared for it. You've lost stock to cold before, she said on the third evening, not quite a question. Once, the word came out, clipped, final. A door he closed fast before she could get a boot in the gap. She studied him a moment. Didn't push, which he noticed, too. Filed away with everything else. Because that was the strange thing happening, the thing he couldn't quite name yet. Wasn't ready to name. She didn't push on the places that were clearly raw. Walked around them the way a careful rider walks horse around a rattlesnake. Giving it room, not provoking it, but not pretending it wasn't there either. He found he respected that more than he expected to. He found he respected a lot of things about her more than he expected to, which was becoming, by the fourth day, something of a problem. The fourth day started with disaster. Small disaster, but disaster all the same. Emmett woke to the smell of smoke that had no business being that strong, and came out of the bed fast, heart already hammering, half convinced the chimney had caught. What he found instead was Guyen standing over the hearth with a look on her face, somewhere between fury and biscuits gone from golden to something closer to charcoal, smoke curling thick toward the rafters. "Your oven's wrong," she said before he could ask. "My oven's the same oven it's always been." "Then it's always been wrong." She jabbed a fork at the ruined biscuits like they'd personally offended her. "Back home we cook over open coals." This she gestured at the small iron stove he'd hauled up from town 2 winters back. "This thing lies about its own heat." "It doesn't lie. You have to know how to read it." "I read it fine. It's lying." "Move," he said, and stepped past her before he could think better of it. Checked the damper, adjusted it with the ease of 4 years' practice. "There runs hot on that side till it's been going an hour. Have to compensate." She watched him do it, arms crossed, expression somewhere between annoyance and something that might, in a more generous light, have passed for reluctant respect. "You couldn't have said that yesterday. You didn't ask yesterday. I didn't know I needed to ask." Her mouth twitched, fighting a smile, he realized, losing the fight slowly. "This is a poorly designed cabin, Emmett Calloway. It's kept me alive 4 winters. Barely, from the state of that cellar I found." But she was smiling now, actually smiling, the first full smile he'd seen from her, and it did something strange to the room, brightened it in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. "Fine. Show me the trick of it properly." "I'll make biscuits that don't taste like punishment," he showed her. Stood close enough at the little stove that he could smoke, and something floral underneath it, some soap or oil she must have brought in that battered bundle of hers, and found himself talking her through damper settings with more patience than he'd shown anybody about anything in longer than he cared to admit. The second batch came out golden. She did not thank him outright, wasn't her way. He was learning, but she set 2 of the good biscuits on his plate before her own, wordless, and that, he understood, was thanks enough. Maybe more honest than words would have been. "Don't get used to it," she said, catching him looking. "Being right, wouldn't dream of it." "Good. Man gets used to being right. He stops listening to when he's wrong." She said it lightly, but something under it wasn't light at all, and he filed that away too, with everything else. Another small brick in the wall of things he was learning about her without her ever quite meaning to teach him. That same afternoon they started the smokehouse in earnest. It was heavier work than either of them said out loud. Logs to notch, a roof to raise. Emmett had built enough structures in his life to know the shape of the labor ahead, and Guyen, it turned out, knew it just as well. Working alongside him with the same economical competence she brought to everything, no wasted motion, no complaint. "Hold this," she said at one point, with guiding a support beam into place, and he stepped in close to brace it, close enough that her hand landed over his on the wood for one brief, unplanned second before she pulled it back. Neither of them said anything about it. Both of them noticed it anyway. He could tell by the way her jaw tightened, the way she busied herself immediately with the next task, hands moving fast like she could outrun the moment by staying occupied. He recognized the trick, used it himself, plenty of times, plenty of years. "You're staring," she said, not looking at him, notching another log with more force than the log strictly required. "Wasn't staring, you were studying. The joint work." He picked up his own log. "Making sure you're doing it right. I'm doing it right." A pause. "You're staring." He let the argument go because there was no winning it, and because if he was honest with himself, which he was trying, lately, to be more often than he used to be, she wasn't wrong. They worked through the afternoon in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable. Somewhere in the last several days, punctuated by short bursts of instruction, of correction, of the occasional dry remark that passed, between them, met for something like humor. By the time the frame stood upright against the darkening sky, both of them were sweating despite the cold, breath coming hard, and there was a particular satisfaction in stepping back to look at a thing they'd built together that Emmett hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to measure. "Good work," she said, simple, no embellishment. But she was looking at him when she said it, not at the smokehouse, and something about that landed harder than the words themselves. "Good work," he agreed, looking back at her the same way. Neither of them moved for a moment. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, cutting through the moment before it could become anything more than what it was. Two people standing close together at dusk, breath visible, something unspoken, sitting heavy and unresolved in the space between them. She broke it first, turned back toward the cabin, toward supper, toward the safer ground of routine. He watched her go a moment before following. Told himself it was only the cold making his chest feel tight. He didn't fully believe himself, was starting to understand he wasn't going to be able to keep believing himself much longer. Not about this, not about her, not about the shape this arrangement was quietly, steadily becoming whether either of them had agreed to it out loud or not. On the fourth night, a smaller thing happened, small enough that he almost missed its weight entirely. She'd been humming while she worked some low, wordless tune he didn't recognize. Apache, maybe, or something older than that. Older than tribes and territories both, and he'd found himself standing in the doorway, just listening. An axe still in his hand, snow melting off his boots onto the floor. She'd swept clean that morning. She stopped when she noticed him. "Don't," he said. Surprised himself saying it. "Don't what?" "Don't stop. On my account." He set the axe down, feeling foolish, feeling exposed in a way he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit. Haven't heard singing in this cabin in a long while. Something passed over her face. Not quite a smile. Something gentler than that and more careful, like she was handling a thing she didn't entirely trust not to break. "Wasn't singing," she said. "Just noise to keep my hands busy while my head's elsewhere." "Where's elsewhere?" She didn't answer right away. Went back to her work instead. Hands moving, the hum starting up again, low under her breath. And he understood the way. He was starting to understand a lot of things about her without being told outright that this was as much answer as he was going to get tonight. He let it be. Went back out for more wood. Found himself on the walk to the woodpile, still hearing that tune in his head, turning it over like a stone in his pocket. Somewhere in that same stretch of days, without either of them quite deciding to start it, a habit began. She'd teach him a word. He'd teach her one back. Small trade, same as everything else between them. Fair and even, nothing given without something returned. "Guyan," she said one evening, tapping her own chest. "You know what it means. Never asked." Wise. She said it plain, no vanity in it. Just fact the way she said most things. "My grandmother named me. Said I came out of my mother already watching everything too closely to be anything else." "Fitz, your turn. Teach me something." He thought a moment. "Duke," he said, nodding toward the lean to where the horse stood. "That's not a word so much as a name, but it's the only one I've got worth teaching. Poor trade. A horse's name for the meaning of mine. Wasn't finished." He considered. "Home. That's the word, I suppose. Been a long while since I had cause to use it for anything but this cabin." Something shifted in her face, quick, careful, gone before he could read the whole of it. "Home," she repeated, testing the shape of the word in her mouth. "Good word. Better than most English words. Most of them sound like they're apologizing for existing. This one doesn't apologize for much." "No," she agreed, quiet now. "I don't suppose it does." They kept at it. Evenings after that, a word or two at a time, nothing forced, nothing rushed. She taught him the Apache word for fire, for water, for the mountains that ring the valley on every side like old sentries that had stood guard longer than either of their lives would run. He taught her the names of things around the cabin, practical words mostly, though some evenings the trade wandered further than practical into words that meant more than they said, words like patience and trust, and once, guess, only once, offered carefully and received just as carefully belonging. Neither of them commented on what it meant that two guarded people kept choosing, night after night, to hand each other pieces of language like small gifts neither could quite bring themselves to name as gifts. But Emmett noticed it, filed it away, same as everything else. And some nights, lying awake, listening to her breathing by the fire, he thought that this slow, careful trading of words, this small unhurried building of something neither of them had asked for, and both of them seemed, somehow, to need might be the first thing in 4 years that hadn't felt like penance. He offered to teach her the rifle that same week, on a clear cold morning with good light and no wind to speak of. "I know how to shoot," she said. Bristled, slightly, at the offer, the way she bristled at anything that sounded like doubt about her competence. Not doubting you can shoot, doubting you've handled A rifle built for a man twice your size with a kick that'll put you on your back if you're not braced right. I've been put on my back before. Rather you weren't again, not on my account. He held the rifle out, stock first. Humor me. She took it, weighed it in her hands, testing the balance, and something in the careful, assessing way she handled it told him she'd handled firearms before, just not this particular breed of them, heavy and long and unforgiving of poor form. He showed her the stance, corrected her grip twice, his hands over hers, only long enough to adjust the angle before he stepped back, giving her room, aware the way he seemed constantly aware of it now, of exactly how close they'd been standing and how briefly. Brace here, he said, against your shoulder, not your arm. Otherwise it'll knock you clean off your feet. You sound like a man who's learned this the hard way. I am a man who's learned this the hard way. Her first shot went wide, kicked harder than she expected despite the warning, and she staggered back half a step with a sound that was equal surprise and irritation. Told you, he said. Couldn't quite keep the satisfaction out of his voice. You could have told me it kicked like an angry mule. Did tell you. You told me it kicked, didn't specify the mule. He laughed. Actually laughed. A short, rough bark of a sound that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her, both of them going still for a moment afterward like. The sound itself was something rare and slightly dangerous, which he supposed. Standing there in the cold, with his breath fogging, and her staring at him like she'd just witnessed something unexpected it was. Didn't know you had that in you, she said. Neither did I. Do it again. Doesn't work like that. Everything works like that. You just have to find the right mule. Her mouth curved, something warm and unguarded, breaking through, and she lifted the rifle again, braced it properly this time, and put the second shot dead center of the stump he'd set up as a target 30 yards off. There, she said. Mule's tamed. Good shot. Good teacher. She said it lightly, tossed off, but something in the way she glanced at him after saying it told him it cost her something to give the compliment plainly. Without armor around it, and he understood he is filing it away with everything else, that this was becoming a habit between them now. Small honesties offered carefully, neither one flinching, most days, when the other one caught them at it. They spent the better part of that morning at it, her form improving with each round until she was putting shots tough together to satisfy even his exacting standards. And by the time they broke for the midday meal, something had settled between them that hadn't been there the week before. Not comfort exactly. Comfort still felt too generous a word for two people carrying as much unspoken weight as they were. But something adjacent to it, something that might, given enough time and enough mornings like this one, grow into comfort eventually. Neither of them said as much out loud. Both of them, in their separate and guarded ways, seemed to feel it all the same. On the fifth night, the storm long passed, the sky outside gone hard and clear and full of more stars than a man ought to be allowed to see all at once. They sat by the fire after supper, and she told him unprompted, which surprised him a little, about where she'd come from. My people are up near the Fort Apache lands, she said, working a piece of hide between her hands, some project he hadn't asked about. Or were. Government's got its own ideas about where we belong now, and those ideas don't much match ours. You get separated from your family. Something crossed her face. Quick. Gone before he could name it properly. The same way that flicker at the door on the first night had come and gone before he could read it. Something like that, she said. He waited. He didn't elaborate. He didn't push, same as she hadn't pushed on his lost stock, on his closed door of a sentence. An unspoken agreement building itself between them, brick by brick, the way trust did when two guarded people decided slowly, carefully, testing each plank before they put their weight on it, that maybe the other one could be trusted with the small truths first. The big ones could come later. They came at all. What about you? She said, turning the question back on him, the way she seemed to do with most things, redirecting rather than revealing. What happened to your wife? The fire popped. Emmett looked at it for a long moment before he answered. A fever. I was away. Scouting for the army. 6 weeks out, and when I came back, he stopped. Didn't finish it. Didn't need to. Some sentences didn't require an ending, because the listener could build the rest themselves out of the silence. And she did. He could see it in her face, the way her expression shifted from curiosity into something quieter. Something that understood exactly the shape of a grief like that without needing the details spelled out. You blame yourself, she said. Not a question, wouldn't you? She considered that. I'd blame the fever. The fever didn't leave her alone for 6 weeks with nobody to fetch a doctor in time. No, she agreed. You did that. And the army that sent you, and the war that needed scouting, and about 100 other things that all had to line up exactly wrong for it to happen the way it happened. You want to carry all of that yourself, you're welcome to. Seems like a heavy pack for one man's back, though. He looked at her. Really looked. For the first time maybe since she'd walked through his door. You always this direct. I don't have time to be anything else. She went back to working the hide in her hands. Neither do you, I think. Though you've been pretending otherwise for a while now. Out here by yourself, letting the pretending count as living. It landed harder than he expected. Hard enough that he didn't have an answer ready. And for once, that didn't feel like losing. They sat a while longer in a silence that had stopped being awkward somewhere in the last few days without his quite noticing when. The fire settled. Outside an owl called once twice and went quiet. Rose, he said finally, into that quiet. That was her name, my wife. Guyen didn't look up from the hide, but her hand slowed. Stilled. Rose, she repeated, careful with it, the way she'd been careful with everything since she arrived. Good name for a thing that doesn't survive winter well. He almost laughed. Caught himself. Found when he looked at her that she hadn't meant it, unkindly meant it instead, the way she seemed to mean most hard truths, plainly, without cushioning, because cushioning cost more than she had to spare. No, he agreed. She didn't. It was 2 days after that, the 6th day since she'd arrived, though neither of them had said the word aloud, the word that would have made this arrangement into something, with a shape, a name, a future that the valley came up. She was telling him about a place her family used to camp in the warmer months, a place with good water and better grazing, describing it with the particular fondness people reserve for places tied to the last good years before everything went wrong. And she said the name of it. Said it plain the way she said most things, and Emmett went very still, because he knew that valley. Knew it the way a man knows the exact shape of a nightmare he's had 100 times, down to the color of the dust and the bend of the creek, and the particular way the light fell through the cottonwoods in late afternoon. He'd ridden through that valley as a young scout, years back, leading a column of cavalry that hadn't been his to lead, but had been his to guide, his knowledge of the terrain, the only thing standing between those soldiers and getting lost in country that didn't forgive lost men. He remembered the smoke, remembered it rising black against a sky that should have been blue, remembered telling himself afterward, for years afterward, that he was only the scout, only the man who knew the trails, that what happened once the column found what it was looking for wasn't his doing, wasn't his choice, wasn't his to carry. He'd told himself that so many times it had almost started to feel true. The memory came at him now anyway, uninvited, the way memories like that always came not asked for, not welcomed. Just there, sudden and total, the creak of saddle leather, the particular dry rustle of cottonwood, leaves in a wind that had smelled, that day, like dust and gun oil, and something underneath both that he hadn't let himself name at the time. A young lieutenant beside him, jaw tight, asking if he was certain this was the right trail, and Emmett 26 years old, proud of his own skill, proud of being the man who knew the country better than any of them, saying yes, certain, this is the way. He remembered the sound the column made moving through brush, remembered, thinking, even then, some small cold part of him thinking that a scout's job was only to find the path, that what waited at the end of the path wasn't his to decide. He had believed that once, had built 16 years' sleep on top of that belief, thin and cracking as the ice on his water trough. He did not, sitting here now with the fire popping, and a woman across from him describing that same valley with tenderness in her voice, believe it anymore. You've gone pale, Guyen said, watching him now with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. What? Nothing. The word came out too fast, too rough. A lie so poorly built it was practically transparent, and he knew it. And from the way her expression shifted, narrowing, sharpening, that assessment beginning all over again. The same cataloging she'd done at the door, on the first night she knew it too. That's not nothing, she said. I've seen men go pale like that exactly once before in my life. You want to tell me what you're not telling me, Emmett Calloway? He didn't. Couldn't. Not yet. not with the shape of it still forming in his own chest, cold and enormous, the sudden terrible arithmetic of how old she'd said she was, and how long ago that column had ridden through that valley, and what a scout's knowledge of the terrain might have cost a family camped in exactly the place she'd just described, with such tenderness in her voice. "Just tired," he said instead. Another lie, worse than the first. She held his gaze a long moment. Didn't call him on it outright. But something had shifted in the room. Some temperature had dropped that had nothing to do with the fire, and they both sat with it, unspoken, the rest of that evening. Because some truths, once they start forming, can't be unformed, can only be delayed. And delay, Emmett was learning, was not the same thing as escape. He barely slept that night. Lay in the dark running the arithmetic over and over, hoping each time it might come out different. It never did. Same valley, same years, same column, same smoke, same young scout who'd told himself for 16 years that guiding wasn't the same as choosing. He almost sat up once, in the dark, mouth already opening around the first word of it, because she was right there. 10 feet away, asleep or close enough to it, and the truth was sitting in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed and could not pass. And some part of him, some tired, worn-down part that had carried this alone for 16 years, wanted nothing more than to set it down. Even if setting it down meant watching her face change. Even if it meant watching her leave. Except leaving was exactly what he couldn't stand to picture. Which was its own kind of terrible, wanting to confess and dreading the confession's only likely outcome in the same breath. The two wants tangled together so tight he couldn't tell anymore which one was driving him upright in the dark, with words already forming behind his teeth. Guyon. Barely a whisper. Testing it, she didn't stir. Sleeping then. Truly sleeping, the first real rest he'd seen take her since she'd arrived. Her face soft in the firelight in a way it never was awake. All that careful vigilance finally briefly let down. He couldn't do it. Couldn't take that from her. Not tonight. Not with her finally resting easy for the first time in who knew how long. Not with 2 riders already circling somewhere out past the tree line. Not with so much already sitting heavy on both their shoulders that adding his own particular weight felt, in that moment, less like honesty and more like cruelty dressed up as virtue. "Coward," a voice in him said. Plain as that. Coward hiding behind her sleep like it was permission. He lay back down anyway. Coward silence settling over him like another blanket, and hated himself for it quietly. Thoroughly, the way he'd hated himself for plenty of things over the years, without it ever once changing anything. Tomorrow, he told himself. He'd find the words tomorrow. He did not yet know that tomorrow would bring tracks in the snow instead, that the confession he kept postponing would keep finding new reasons to wait. Because that was the trouble with truths like his. The longer a man carried one, the heavier it grew. And the heavier it grew, the more convincing every excuse to wait one more day became. He fell asleep, finally, sometime near dawn, still rehearsing words he hadn't managed to say. The 7th day brought the tracks. He found them in the morning, while checking the trap lines alone. She'd stayed back to work on the smokehouse they'd been building together, a project that had somehow, without either of them quite deciding it, become a shared one rather than a chore assigned. Horse tracks, 2 sets, coming up the old trail from the direction of town, then stopping, then circling back the way they'd come, like whoever rode them had gotten close enough to see the smoke from his chimney, and then thought better of approaching. Or thought better of approaching in daylight. He crouched over the tracks a long moment, read them the way he'd been trained to read them, years back, a lifetime back. 2 riders, good horses, well shod, not Apache mounts, careful about their approach, careful about their retreat, not lost hunters, not wrong turns, men looking for something, or someone. He followed the tracks a short distance, far enough to confirm what the first look had already told him. The riders had stopped here, at this exact rise, where the tree line broke just enough to give a clean sight line down to the cabin's chimney smoke. Sat their horses a while. The snow was packed here, disturbed in a way that meant minutes, not seconds, then turned, unhurried, which was worse, somehow, than if they'd come charging in reckless and loud. Men in a hurry made mistakes. Men who took their time, who scouted first and approached second, who circled back instead of pushing forward, those were men working a plan. Men who'd done this before. He knew the type because he'd once been the type, had ridden exactly this kind of careful, patient reconnaissance himself. Years back, for reasons he was only now starting to let himself examine honestly. The uncomfortable symmetry of it sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone. He didn't like the shape of that thought. Didn't like it at all. He said nothing to her at first. Told himself it was probably nothing. A lost hunter. A rider who'd taken a wrong turn and corrected it. But that evening, cleaning his rifle by the fire, he caught her watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Wary. Coiled tight. The way she must have been the night she first knocked on his door. "You're jumpy tonight," he said. "So are you." "Fair. You found something today," she said. "Not a question." "Out at the traps." He should have known better than to think he could hide it from her. She'd been cataloging him since the moment she walked through that door, same as he'd been cataloging her, and a man who'd been jumpy and distracted all evening wasn't fooling a woman who noticed everything. "Tracks," he admitted. "Two riders. Came close. Turned back. Her hands, which had been steady on the mending in her lap, went very still." "How close?" "Close enough to see the smoke." She set the mending aside. Looked at him steady, the way she looked at most difficult things head on, refusing to flinch first. "There's something you should know about me," she said. "Before this goes any further. Before you decide you want me staying past whatever number of days you were counting on when you let me through that door." He set the rifle aside. Waited. "There was a man," she said, "back near the agency lands. Before I came here, he decided I belonged to him whether I agreed to it or not, and when I made it clear I didn't, he didn't take that well." Her hands, Emmett noticed, had gone very still in her lap. "He came at me with a knife," she said. "Mine found him first." The fire cracked. Neither of them moved. "He didn't get up again," she said. "And the men who called him friend decided that made me a murderer instead of a woman defending her own life. Because the law out here has a way of counting some lives heavier than others. And mine's never been one of the heavy ones. So I ran. And I kept running. Mostly north, mostly at night. Until I found this valley and saw smoke coming from a chimney that looked like it belonged to a man living alone." She looked up at him then, steady, unflinching, daring him to be afraid of her or angry at her or anything at all except exactly what he already was. "That's who's asking you for a roof," she said. "Not some helpless woman lost in a storm. A woman with men out there who might still be looking for her and might find this cabin eventually if they look long enough. And if that's more trouble than you signed on for, I understand."
Go.
"I'll go. Tonight if you want it," you said. His friends called him that. Friend. Some men keep bad company. Don't make the company any less loyal when it counts. How many of them? Could be more by now. Trouble like this has a way of collecting itself. She met his eyes, unflinching. "You still want me under this roof, knowing that." "Asked you already." "Answer hasn't changed. Ask me again in a week once you've had time to think on it properly. See if it's still the same answer."
"Won't be something faced, braced."
"Won't be the same," he said. "Might be more certain, is all." That landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to. He watched her absorb it, watched the careful armor she wore slip just slightly, just for a breath, before she caught it and pulled it back into place. Emmett sat with that for a long moment. Thought about the tracks from that morning, circling close and turning back. Thought about the valley, and the smoke, and the arithmetic he still hadn't found the courage to finish doing out loud. Two secrets sitting across the fire from each other. Both of them circling the same darkness from different directions. Neither one ready yet to say the whole of it. "You're not going anywhere tonight," he said finally. "Not into that cold. Not with riders maybe still out there." "That's not an answer to what I told you. It's the only answer I've got right now." He held her gaze. "Rest of it we'll figure out when there's daylight and I've had time to think straight." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Went back to her mending, though her hands, he noticed, didn't fully stop shaking for another hour. "You didn't ask if he deserved it," she said, quiet. Sometime later, not looking up. Most men ask that first, whether he deserved it. Didn't need to ask. "Why not?" "Because you're still here," Emmett said, "and a woman who did something wrong for wrong reasons doesn't usually spend a week rebuilding another man's root cellar and fixing his traps out of guilt. She runs and keeps running. You stop. That tells me plenty." Something moved across her face. Gone too fast to name, same as always. But her shoulders, which had been braced tight since the moment she'd started her story, eased by some small fraction, and she went back to the mending with hands that were, if not entirely steady, at least steadier than before. He didn't sleep that night either. Lay in the dark listening to the wind, and beneath the wind, some new and colder sound, the sound of a reckoning approaching from two directions at once, hers and his, both of them walking toward a truth neither had said aloud yet, because he hadn't told her about the valley, hadn't told her what he suspected, what the arithmetic was starting to spell out, with a clarity he didn't want and couldn't stop, and because somewhere out there in the dark, past the tree line, past the ridge, two riders had turned their horses around instead of coming closer, which meant they'd be back. He knew men like that, knew the patient, much methodical way they worked, circling wider before they came in close, making sure of what they were walking into before they walked into it. They'd be back. Question was only when. He rose before dawn, restless, and stood at the window, watching the gray light climb slow over the ridgeline, the valley below still and white and deceptively peaceful, like a held breath. He almost missed it at first. A shape at the tree line, far off, still as a fence post. Then it moved. A rider, sitting his horse in the shadow of the pines, watching the cabin the way a man watches something he means to come back for. Emmett's hand found the rifle without his telling it to. The rider didn't approach. Sat there a long moment, unmoving, close enough that Emmett understood with a certainty that landed cold and heavy in his chest that this was no accident of terrain, no lost traveler correcting course. This was a man confirming a location, marking it, filing it away, the same careful cataloging Nguyen had done at his door on the first night, except this cataloging wasn't building toward trust. Then, slow, deliberate, forward, the rider turned his horse and rode back into the trees, and was gone. Emmett stood at the window a long while after, rifle still in hand, breath fogging the glass. Behind him the floorboards creaked. He turned. Nguyen stood in the doorway of the sleeping area, blanket around her shoulders, and one look at her face told him she'd been awake longer than he'd realized, watching him watch the window. "You saw him too?" she said. "Not a question." "Saw him. Raven's been circling that same tree line since before dawn." She nodded toward the far ridge, voice tight and controlled in a way that cost her something to keep controlled. "Wouldn't settle. Wouldn't feed. Just circled. My grandmother used to say a raven that won't land is a raven that's found something it doesn't like the smell of. Could be nothing. Could be." She didn't sound like she believed it any more than he did. Could also be exactly what it looks like. They stood there a moment, the two of them, used on opposite sides of a small cabin that had started to feel, in the space of 1 week, considerably less like a fortress and considerably more like a target. "They find this place," she said quiet now. "It won't matter what deal we made at that door. Won't matter what's fair between us. Men like that don't stop for fair. I know the kind." "Do you?" She studied him. That same sharp assessment from the first night, except now there was something else underneath it, something that looked almost like fear, held carefully in check. "Because I've run from men like that before, Emmett Calloway, and I know exactly how far running gets a person once they've decided you're worth the trouble of chasing." This was different from lying awake alone with it. She was standing right here, wide awake, handing him an opening wide enough to walk a confession through. All he had to do was step into it. He didn't. Couldn't. Not with riders somewhere out past that tree line, and her nerves already stretched thin as fence wire. Adding 16 years of buried truth to that felt less like honesty tonight and more like one more weight dropped on a woman already carrying too much. The words piled up behind his teeth and stayed there anyway, and he hated himself for the excuse even as he reached for it. "Get some rest," he said instead. "I'll keep watch till light." She held his gaze one more moment like she knew, the way she seemed to know most things about him, now that he was holding something back. Then she nodded, once, and retreated to the fire, and he stood at that window until the gray finally gave way to a hard, pale morning, watching a tree line that had gone still and quiet, and gave nothing else away. Somewhere out there, men were looking for the woman asleep by his fire, and somewhere in his own chest, a truth about a column of cavalry and a valley full of smoke was waiting for him to finally say it out loud. He wasn't ready for either reckoning, but standing there in the cold gray dark, watching his breath fog the window glass, he understood with a certainty that settled into his bones like the coming winter itself, ready or not. Both were coming, and soon. By mid-morning the tree line had given up nothing more, no riders, No sign of the raven that had circled so restlessly at dawn. Just snow and pine, and a silence so complete it felt, to Emet, less like peace and more like the held breath before a held breath. He found Guyen at the smokehouse when he finally went looking for her, hanging the last of the venison strips with hands that moved steady despite everything, because that, he was learning, was simply how she met the world. Steady hands. Whatever was happening underneath them. "You're still here," he said. Meant it as relief. "Wasn't sure it came out that way. Told you I would be." She didn't look up from her work. "Told you I don't run twice from the same fear in 1 week. Runs out the usefulness of running. That a rule you live by. It's the only rule that's kept me alive this long." She finally glanced at him, something searching in the look, like she was still trying to read whatever he'd been keeping folded up behind his silence at the window that morning. "You going to tell me what's sitting on you, Emmett Calloway? Or am I going to keep guessing at it? Same as you're guessing at what's coming for me." He opened his mouth. The valley sat right there behind his teeth, ready the column, the smoke. 16 years of telling himself a scout only found the path and never chose what waited at the end of it. Third time now he'd come this close. Third time the words had stalled out before they cleared his throat. "Soon," he said instead. "I'll tell you soon." She held his gaze a long moment, weighing that, the way she seemed to weigh everything before deciding whether to spend her trust on it. "Soon," she repeated, not quite believing him, not quite disbelieving him either. "I'll hold you to that." He nodded, turned back toward the cabin, toward the woodpile, toward whatever order might buy him a few more hours of silence before the truth he owed her finally came due. Neither of them knew that gray morning just how little time Soon actually had left to run. Because far past the ridge, past the tree line where a patient rider had sat his horse at dawn, and marked a location worth remembering, word was already moving down through the hills, toward a town neither of them had visited in a week, where men were beginning to talk in low voices about smoke rising from an isolated cabin, and a fugitive woman last seen heading north, and a name, Emmett Calloway's name, that one particular man in that particular town would recognize the moment he heard it. A name attached to a rank and a column that man had never once managed to forget. The storm that had blown Guyen through Emmett's door was long past now, the sky scrubbed clean and hard and blue. But another storm was already gathering, slower than snow and twice as dangerous, moving toward that small cabin from two directions. At once the truth Emmett carried, and the men who carried theirs. And neither one, when it finally arrived, was going to knock politely and wait to be let in. Soon did not arrive quickly. 3 days passed after that gray morning at the window, 3 days of Emmett rehearsing words that stayed rehearsed, never spoken, while the two of them worked the cabin's chores with a careful, watchful rhythm neither called by its true name. Because the true name was waiting. Waiting for riders that didn't come. Waiting for a confession that hadn't yet found its courage. Waiting the way a held breath waits, for whichever reckoning arrived first to finally arrive at all. The valley sat between them the whole time, unspoken, though Emmett caught her watching him some evenings, with the question half formed behind her eyes, like she'd already guessed some shape of what he was still too much a coward to say outright. He told himself he'd find the moment. Told himself soon, again and again, until the word had nearly worn itself smooth from overuse. Then the wolves came, and there was no more room left for waiting. The wolves came first. 3 nights after the riders vanished into the tree line, Emmett woke to Duke, screaming. Not whinings, screaming. The kind of sound a horse only made once in its life, if it was lucky enough to survive making it twice. He was out the door before his boots were fully laced, rifle already in hand. Because there wasn't time for laces. Wasn't time for anything except moving fast. Cold air hitting his lungs like a slap. Boots crunching frost-hard snow toward a sound that had already gone from bad to worse in the space of 2 heartbeats. Guyen was faster, already moving past him into the dark, knife drawn, because that was who she was now, 3 nights into this new fear, a woman who ran toward trouble instead of away from it, because running away had never once worked out for her. The lean-to was chaos, 2 shapes low and gray circling the frantic horse. Wolves. Big ones, winter-thin and winter-desperate, which made them worse than any wolf fat and lazy off-summer game. Their eyes caught the faint moonlight and threw it back, flat and hungry, and Emmett's chest tightened with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anything else he had a ready name for. Left one, Guyen said. Flat, fast. No wasted words. Got it. He fired. The shot took the close wolf clean through the shoulder, dropped it, snarling into the snow. The second one turned. Hesitated. Except hesitation was a luxury a starving animal couldn't afford twice. It lunged. Not at Emmett. At Guyen she didn't flinch. Didn't step back. Just planted her feet and met it with the knife. Fast and sure, the way she'd met whatever had come at her before. Back near the agency lands. Back when running out of choices had taught her hands what they needed to know. The wolf went down. Stayed down. Silence after. Just breathing. Just Duke's panic stamping slowing gradually into something less than terror. And Emmett's own heart hammering against his ribs like it hadn't gotten the message yet that the danger had passed, still half convinced it hadn't. Because for one full second, one terrible, frozen second between the wolf's lunge and the knife, finding its mark, he'd been certain. He was about to watch her die in the snow 10 feet from him, and there had been nothing in that second except the cold, blank certainty that he could not survive watching. It happened twice in one lifetime. He hadn't known until that second exactly how much of himself he'd already handed over. You're bleeding, Emsa said, her forearm. A shallow gash, dark against her skin in the moonlight. Barely. Barely still bleeding. Then quit talking and get me inside where there's light to look at it. Which he did. Which became, over the next hour, something neither of them commented on out loud. His hands cleaning the wound, her jaw tight against the sting. The two of them closer in that small firelit space than either had planned to be. Breath and silence, and the particular intimacy of one person tending another's hurt. You didn't run, he said. Finally, needle and thread in hand closing the last stitch. Didn't occur to me to, should've. Wolf, that size, would have had to leave you to it then. She watched him work. Steady despite the pain. Never been much good at leaving people to it. He didn't have an answer for that. Just kept his hands steady and finished the stitch, and told himself the tightness in his chest was concern for the wound and nothing more. He was getting worse, he noted privately, at lying to himself, because that lie didn't hold for more than the length of one breath before the truth crowded back in. Plain and undeniable, he hadn't been simply concerned. He'd been terrified. Genuinely, bone-deep terrified, watching a wolf lunge for a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks, and that terror had told him something he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. He said nothing, tied off the thread instead. They needed supplies after that. The wolf attack had cost them a week's worth of careful rationing, torn hide they could ill afford to lose, and there was no putting off the ride to town any longer. Storm or no storm, riders or no riders. You should stay, he said, the morning they set out. Let me go alone, and leave you to explain a woman's mending hanging on your line if anybody rides up while I'm gone. She was already saddling her own horse, with borrowed from his small string, moving with the same efficient certainty she brought to everything. No, we go together, careful. But together. He didn't argue further. Had learned by now which arguments were worth having with her, and which ones simply weren't. The town sat low in a shallow bowl of land, a scatter of clapboard buildings around a single dusty street, smoke rising thin from a dozen chimneys. Emmett felt the change the moment they rode in. Felt eyes. Felt the particular weight of a town's attention shifting, door by door, window by window, as word of who was riding beside him moved faster than they could. Eyes on us, Guyen said, quiet, not looking at anyone directly. I see them. Doesn't bother you. Bothers me plenty. Just learned a long time back not to let it show. They tied up outside the general store. Inside, the clerk's smile for Emmett faltered the instant Guyen stepped through the door behind him, and the silence that followed had teeth in it, the particular silence of a room deciding, collectively, whether to say something ugly out loud or simply let the ugliness sit unspoken in the air like smoke. Nobody said it outright, but Emmett felt every word not said pile up anyway, heavy as the ones that would have been worse. It was on the street outside, loading the last of the flour onto the pack horse, that Emmett saw him, a man he recognized. Older now than in memory, gray threading through a beard that had been dark the last time Emmett had seen it, but the eyes were the same. Hard. Assessing. A colonel's eyes, even stripped of the uniform. Silas Briggs. Emmett's stomach dropped, because Briggs had been his commanding officer years back. The very column, the very valley Briggs had led it, and Emmett had scouted it, and whatever guilt Emmett carried alone in the darks most nights, Briggs carried a version of it too, though Emmett doubted the man carried it the same way. Briggs saw him. Recognition flickered, then sharpened into something colder. Calloway, just the name. Flat as a closing door, Colonel. Not anymore. Briggs's gaze slid past him. Landed on Guyon. Held there a beat too long. Heard there's a woman matching a certain description. Been seen riding these hills. Apache woman. Wanted for a killing near the agency lands. The air went very still. Don't know anything about that, Emmett said. Even. Didn't ask if you knew anything. Briggs's mouth curved. No warmth in it at all. Just making conversation, Calloway. Small towns. Word travels. Word travels wrong plenty in my experience. Does it? Briggs's eyes didn't leave Guyon's face the whole time he spoke, and she held that stare without flinching. Chin level, giving him nothing. One. We'll see whose word's right. Before too long he turned. Walked away. Didn't look back. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Emmett's pulse was still hammering, some old soldier's instinct screaming at him that this was not a chance meeting, not a coincidence of small-town streets. Briggs had come here looking, and now Briggs had found exactly what he'd come looking for. You know him, Guyon said. Not a question. Knew him. Long time back. How long? Emmett's jaw tightened. Long enough that some debts don't finish coming due. She looked at him a long moment, reading something in his face he hadn't meant to let show, and he understood with a sinking, sickening certainty that she'd caught the shape of it even without the details. Understood, too, that the details couldn't wait much longer. That soon had very nearly run out of room. They stopped at the blacksmith's last, needing a new shoe fitted for the pack horse before the ride home. Amos Whitfield had been forging iron in that same shed for going on 15 years, and Emmett had counted him once, as close to a friend as this territory offered a man who mostly kept to himself. Calloway, Amos didn't quite meet his eyes. Didn't expect to see you in for a while yet. Horse needs shoeing. Won't take long. No. Won't take long. Something in the way Amos said it, too careful, too quick, snagged at Emmett's attention even before he could name why. Guyon noticed too. He saw it in the way her shoulders squared, the way her eyes tracked Amos's hands as he worked. Reading something in the man's nervous movements that Emmett was only starting to catch himself. Man came through yesterday, Amos said, not looking up from the shoe. Asking after a woman fits her description. Offering money. Good money, Calloway, more than I see in half a year of honest forging. The hammer paused, just for a heartbeat, against the iron. You take it, Emmett said. Quiet. Not quite a question. Amos didn't answer right away, and that silence, stretching a beat too long, told Emmett everything the man wasn't willing to say out loud. Didn't say where, Amos said finally. Didn't have to say much. Man like that, he's got eyes of his own. Watches the roads. Watches who rides out of town toward which valley. He set the hammer down. Wouldn't look at either of them now. I've got a family to feed, Calloway. That's all I'll say on it. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The forge fire popped and hissed, indifferent to the small betrayal settling into the air between three people who'd once counted each other loosely as something like friends. How much time, Guyon said. First word she'd offered the whole visit. Flat. Direct. Don't know that there's much time left to have, Amos said. Ashamed at least of that much. I'm sorry. I truly am. But sorry doesn't feed anybody either. They rode out fast after that, the shoeing barely finished. Both of them silent. Both of them running the same grim arithmetic, a bought tongue, a marked trail, and men out there who'd have known within the hour exactly which direction to point their horses. He was your friend, Guyon said, once the town had shrunk small behind them. Thought he was. Money's a cheap thing to trade friendship for. Money's not cheap to a man with children going hungry. Emmett's jaw was tight. Doesn't make it right. Just makes it understandable, which is worse somehow. Easier to hate a man for something that isn't understandable. She didn't answer that, but he saw her glance back once, toward the smoke rising thin from the town they'd left behind, and understood she was doing the same arithmetic he was, counting hours, counting miles, counting exactly how much of a head start a bought tongue had already cost them. It was near midnight when the horses stirred. Emmett came awake instantly, hand already on the rifle, and found Guyon already alert beside him, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the dark beyond their small shelter. Someone's out there, she breathed. Sound like two. Moving careful. They waited. Breath held. The cold biting through wool and hide, and somewhere below them, boots crunching snow, deliberate, forward, patient, the same patient men who'd circled the cabin days before. A voice low carried up on the wind. Not close enough for words, close enough to know direction. Except direction was enough, because direction meant they'd found the camp's general position, if not its exact seam in the rock, and a position found tonight became a position surrounded by morning if they didn't move. "They're not tracking us," Emmett whispered. "They're tracking the horse's trail from town. Same thing from where I'm standing. Not if we move now. Quiet. Leave the trail behind before they close the gap." They led the horses out on foot, bits muffled with cloth against any accidental jingle, picking a route across bare rock where hooves left nothing behind to follow. Below them, faint, a lantern flared once and went dark again, close enough that Emmett's chest went tight with a certainty that one wrong sound, one loose stone kicked free underfoot, would end this before it had properly begun. Nguyen moved like she'd done this her whole life, which, he understood, watching her thread through the dark, with barely a whisper of sound, she probably had. They didn't stop until the lantern light had shrunk to nothing behind them, and the stars had wheeled a full quarter turn overhead. What followed was 2 days Emmett would remember, later, in fragments, cold ridgelines and colder nights, moving fast and careful through country that punished mistakes, Nguyen reading sign behind them that told them, again and again, that the gap was closing slower than it should have, but closing all the same, because that was the trouble with patient men. They didn't need to be fast. They only needed to be relentless, and relentless. Emmett was learning, described Silas Briggs's men exactly. Once midday on the first day, they'd frozen against a rock face for the better part of an hour, while 2 riders passed below on the trail they'd just abandoned, close enough that Emmett could hear the creak of saddle, close enough that a single spooked horse would have ended everything. Nguyen's hand had found his in the stillness, gripped tight, and he hadn't let go until the riders' voices faded fully out of hearing. "Close," she breathed once it was safe to breathe at all. "Too close. We can't keep running blind like this." Not blind. He studied the ridgeline ahead, the shape of country he knew better than most men alive. "There's a pass 2 miles east, narrow. One man could hold it against a dozen if he had to. We take that. We're not running anymore. We're choosing the ground." She looked at him a long moment, something steadying in her expression, some trust she hadn't fully extended before settling into place. "Then we choose it," she said. On the second night, exhausted, pressed into a narrow crevice of rock with a fire too small to warm much beyond their hands, she finally asked the question she'd been holding back since the general store. "Tell me about the valley," she said. "The one I told you about that first week. The one that made you go pale." He'd known this was coming, had rehearsed it, in the dark, more times than he could count. None of the rehearsals made it easier. "I scouted for the army," he said. Slow, each word costing him something. "Years back, a column moving through Apache country, looking for a camp reported to be hostile. I knew the terrain better than any man they had. I found the trail. The valley you told me about," he said. "That was the camp. I led them to it." Silence. The fire cracked small and stubborn against the dark. "You knew," she said, voice flat, dangerous in its flatness. "That first week, when I told you where my family camped, you knew and you said nothing. I didn't know how to say it. You had a week. I know, you had a week, and every day of it you let me sit across your fire trading words with you." Like she stopped, breathed, started again, quieter, worse for the quiet, like it meant something. "And the whole time, you knew. It did mean something. Don't," the word came out sharp. A blade, not a shield. "Don't you dare tell me what it meant while you're still deciding what else to hide." He had nothing to offer against that. No defense that wouldn't sound, in his own ears, like exactly the kind of excuse he'd spent 16 years refusing to let himself make. "I was a scout," he said anyway, because some truths needed saying even when they changed nothing. "I found the trail. I didn't give the order. I didn't fire a shot. I've told myself that for 16 years that finding the path isn't the same as choosing what waits at the end of it. Do you believe that?" "I did, before I met you." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "Don't know what I believe anymore." She said nothing for a long time, just watched the fire, arms wrapped around her knees, and Emmett sat with the silence and let it do whatever it needed to do, because he'd earned every second of it and knew better than to rush her through it, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like begging. And begging was exactly the kind of thing he'd sworn 16 years back he'd never do again, not for forgiveness, not for absolution, not for anything that couldn't be earned honestly through years, instead of words spoken in a single desperate night. So he waited, let the fire burn low. Let her decide, in her own time, whether anything he'd said tonight was worth keeping, or whether it belonged. Same as the man who'd come at her with a knife. In a past she'd have to keep outrunning. My mother died in that valley, she said finally. Quiet. Terrible in its quiet. My brother too, I was 12. I remember the smoke, I remember running, I'm sorry. The words felt absurdly small against what they were meant to hold. There's no version of sorry big enough for this. I know that. No, she agreed, there isn't. The fire popped. Somewhere below them, wind moved through rock in a low, mournful sound that could have been the mountain itself grieving alongside them. I used to dream about the smoke, she said after a while, voice barely above the fire's low crackle. Even years after. Woke up smelling it sometimes, certain the cabin was burning, certain I had to run again. Took me a long time to learn the difference between memory and danger, longer than I'd like to admit. Do you still dream it? Less, lately. She glanced at him, quick, something unreadable, passing behind her eyes. Don't know if that's a mercy or another thing you've taken from me, without meaning to, making the memory smaller by being kind to me while it was still sitting there the whole time, unspoken, between us. He had no answer for that either. Some hurts, he was learning, didn't come with answers. Only with the slow, unglamorous work of staying, and hoping staying counted for something, eventually, even when it couldn't undo a single thing that had already happened. They didn't speak again that night. But she didn't move away from the small fire either, didn't put distance between them the way he half expected, half feared she would, just sat, wrapped in her own grief and his guilt, two griefs that had turned out, impossibly, cruelly, to be tangled around the same valley, the same smoke, the same 16 years of separate suffering. Neither had known the other carried. It was near the last hour before dawn, the fire down to embers, that she spoke again, so quiet he nearly missed it beneath the wind. You could have let me walk back out into that first storm, she said. 2 weeks ago. Would have been simpler, no valley between us, no truth to carry. Didn't want simpler. Want it now. He thought about that a long moment, watching the last of the embers pulse orange in the dark. No, he said finally. Plain. Certain in the one thing he was still certain of. Whatever else I've got wrong, I don't want you gone. Wanted that before I knew what the wanting meant. Still want it now, even with all of this sitting raw between us. She didn't answer right away. But something in her shoulders eased. Some fraction of the distance the valley had put, between them closing again. Not fully, not yet, but enough. That's not nothing, she said finally, after tonight. It's not everything either, but it's not nothing. I'll take not nothing. Good, she said, because it's all I've got to give you right now. They sat with that a while, the fire dying between them, neither one reaching for the other, but neither one pulling further away either. And Emmett understood, in the gray hour before real dawn finally broke, that whatever came next Briggs, the riders, the storm building somewhere west of them, he would face, all of it a different man than the one who'd split wood alone in the cold, 2 weeks back, waiting for a winter he expected to survive completely by himself. Dawn found them moving again. Silent. The silence a different creature now than the comfortable one they'd built. Over 2 weeks sharper, rawer, full of things said that couldn't be unsaid. It was near midday, cresting a ridge that overlooked a narrow pass, that they found Briggs waiting, not ambushed, waiting. Sitting his horse in plain sight. Alone, no sign of the second rider anywhere near. Sent my man back, Briggs said, before Emmett could raise the rifle. This conversation doesn't need an audience. Then talk. You know why I'm here, Calloway. I can guess. Guess out loud. I want to hear you say it. Briggs's eyes had gone hollow in a way Emmett hadn't noticed back in town. Some deeper wound sitting behind the coldness. You're hunting her for a killing that was self-defense. That's the paperwork version. Briggs's jaw tightened. You want the real version? Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. My son rode with that column, Briggs said. The one you scouted. Same valley her family camped in. He didn't come home from the skirmish after different fight, different year. But same war. Same country. Same people who never once stopped fighting back. After we burned what we burned. His voice had gone rough, unsteady in a way that didn't match the hard eyes at all. I've spent 10 years hating the people who took him. Found out 3 weeks back that the woman I've been hunting lost her whole family to the very column my boy rode with. Funny thing, grief doesn't much care whose side of a war it's supposed to be loyal to. So let her go, Emmett said. You know what was done to her family. Doesn't change what she did to that man near the agency. Self-defense isn't a crime. It's a crime if the judge deciding it never once considers her word worth the same as a white man's. Briggs's mouth twisted, bitter. You know that as well as I do, Calloway. You scouted the same wars I fought. You know exactly how little her word is worth in front of the men who'll decide this. Your son, Guyon said, quiet. First word she'd offered him directly. What was his name? Briggs went still. Hadn't expected the question. Hadn't Emmett suspected been asked it gently and longer than he could remember. Daniel, he said finally. Rough. 19 years old. Wanted to be a rancher, not a soldier. Enlisted anyway because his older brothers had, because it seemed like the thing a Briggs man did. Something moved through his face fast and raw. Buried an empty box, mostly. Never did recover enough of him to fill it proper. I'm sorry for that, Guyon said. Truly. No mother, no father should bury an empty box. I know what that hollow feels like. I've carried my own version of it since I was 12. Briggs looked at her a long moment, something in his hard face working itself loose. Inch by inch, like ice giving way under weight it could no longer hold. Guyon hadn't said a single word before that. Sat her horse in silence, face unreadable, though Emmett could see, even from a distance, that her hands were not quite steady on the reins. Then what do you want? Emmett said. If you know all that, and you're still out here. Briggs looked at him a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, grief, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying a hatred so long. He no longer entirely trusted himself to set it down even when he wanted to. I want my boy back, he said finally. Quiet. Can't have that. So I'll settle for bringing somebody in, anybody. Because a man's got to have something to show for 10 years of hating Calloway, or the hating was for nothing, and I can't. His voice broke, just slightly, before he caught it. I can't have it be for nothing. It already is, Guyon said. First word she'd spoken. Whatever you bring in, whoever you drag back to answer for it, it won't bring your son home. Won't make the hating feel like it was worth carrying. I know. I've carried the same weight since I was 12 years old, and it's never once gotten lighter for anything I did to make it so. Briggs stared at her. Something in his face cracked, just barely, the hard colonel's mask slipping enough to show the grieving father underneath. Got one more rider coming up behind me, he said, finally, voice rough. You won't be as patient as I've been. They know where your cabin sits, Calloway. Found the location 3 days back. Emmett's blood went cold. You're warning us. I'm telling you what's coming. Briggs turned his horse, wouldn't meet either of their eyes now. What you do with the warning is your business. But there's a storm building west of here, and if I were you, I wouldn't wait around to see which arrives at that cabin first. My men, or the weather. He rode off without another word. Emmett and Guyon sat their horses in silence a long moment, the wind picking up cold and sharp around them, carrying the first hard scent of snow. He'll be back, Guyon said, with or without those riders. Men like that don't stop just because they've said a true thing out loud once. I know. So what do we do? Emmett looked west, where the sky had already begun bruising purple at the edges, the same warning color that had greeted him the night she first knocked on his door. We go home, he said. We prepare. And whatever's coming, we meet it together. That's the only answer I've got left worth giving. She studied him a long moment. The valley still sat between them, unhealed, raw as the wound on her forearm. But something in her expression had shifted since the ridge, some small crack of understanding opening in the place where only anger had lived an hour before. Together, she repeated, testing the word, the way she'd tested every word he'd taught her weeks back, by a fire that felt, suddenly, very far away. Together, he said again. They turned their horses toward home, toward a cabin that no longer felt safe, a storm that no longer felt like only weather, and a reckoning that both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, was no longer a matter of if. The ride back took the better part of a day, both of them pushing the horses harder than was wise, because wisdom had become a luxury neither could afford to indulge. Emmett watched the sky the whole way. The purple bruise at the horizon deepening hour by hour into something blacker, heavier, a storm building with the particular malice of weather that meant to arrive with everything it had. They crested the final ridge above the valley as the light was failing, and there, thin and pale against the darkening sky, rose smoke. His own chimney, his own cabin, sitting exactly where he'd left it 4 days back. Except something was wrong with the picture. He felt it before he could name it, the same old scout's instinct that had never once, in all his years, steered him wrong. Too much smoke. More than one banked fire alone would throw. Someone's there, Nguyen said, voice flat, already reaching for her knife. They approached on foot the last quarter-mile, horses left tied in a stand of pine, moving low and careful through snow that had begun, finally, to fall fat. Heavy flakes, the storm's first gentle warning before its full fury arrived. From the tree line, Emmett could see them, 2 men, moving around the cabin's perimeter, with the unhurried confidence of men who believed they had all the time in the world. Checking the lean-to, checking the windows. One of them crouched at the door, working the lock with the patient competence of a man who'd done this kind of work before. Briggs's riders arrived ahead of them, exactly as warned, exactly as feared. "They're not waiting for us," Emmett breathed. "They're making themselves comfortable, settling in. Wait for how long? Long as it takes. Storm's going to buy them cover, not chase them off." He watched the snow thicken, the wind beginning its low moan through the pines, the same sound that had greeted the first storm, the one that had brought her to his door 2 weeks back. "We can't go in tonight. Not with 2 of them dug in and expecting exactly this. So we wait too. We wait. We watch. And when the storm's thick enough to hide movement, we find a way in that doesn't walk straight through their front door." Nguyen studied the cabin a long moment, jaw tight, eyes narrowed against the thickening snow. "That's my home too, now," she said. "Quiet, fierce. Whatever it started as, whatever bargain got me through that door in the first place, I'm not watching 2 strangers sit inside it like they've already won. Neither am I." She looked at him, then, snow catching in her dark hair, and something passed between them that needed no further words, a decision made together, the way every decision between them had slowly, carefully become since that first night she dropped her bundle by his hearth and named her price plainly. Together that decision said, whatever came next. They settled into the cover of the rocks above the cabin as full dark fell, the storm gathering its strength around them, and watched the smoke from their own chimney curl up into a sky that no longer belonged, even for one more night, entirely to them. The wind rose steadily as the hours passed. Not yet a blizzard. Not yet the full fury Emmett could feel building somewhere behind the clouds, pressure gathering the same way it had 2 weeks back, the warning ache settling into his old knee like a clock, counting down towards something neither of them could stop, because that was the cruelty of it. 2 storms converging on one small cabin, the one made of ice and wind, and the one made of men with guns and grievances and a colonel's cold patience running somewhere behind them, closing the gap mile by mile. Below, one of the men fed the fire in the hearth. Emmett watched the light shift behind the shuttered window, watched a shadow move past it, and felt something in his chest go tight and cold and terribly, terribly clear. That was his fire, his hearth. The one Rose had built curtains for once. In a life so far removed from this moment, it barely felt like his own anymore. The one Nguyen had knelt before on her first night, soaked and shaking, offering a trade neither of them had known yet would become so much more than a trade. He was not going to lose that fire to strangers waiting inside it like conquerors. "You're thinking too loud," Nguyen murmured beside him, barely audible over the rising wind. "Didn't know thinking made noise. Yours does. Whole body goes tight, like a bowstring somebody's about to loose." She glanced at him, snow gathering pale in her dark hair, her voice steadier than he felt. "Whatever's coming, we'll meet it clear-headed, not angry. Angry gets people killed. You sound like you've done this before. I've survived worse odds than 2 tired men in a storm." Something flickered behind her eyes, old and hard-won. "Just never had somebody beside me while I did it. That part's new." He looked at her a long moment, snow settling between them, the cabin's stolen light flickering faint through the shutters below. "Get used to it," he said. "I'm not planning on being anywhere else." She didn't answer, didn't need to. Just reached over, briefly, and pressed her cold hand against his, a wordless promise sealed in the last calm minute either of them would have for a long while yet, because below them, The wind was already climbing toward a scream. And somewhere out past the ridge, in the direction Briggs had ridden off toward hours before, one more rider was pushing his horse hard through the gathering dark, closing whatever distance remained between the past. Both Emmett and Guyon had been running from, and the reckoning neither of them could outrun any longer. Only how soon the reckoning would come, and how much of them would still be standing when it finally arrived. The storm broke fully an hour before midnight. Not snow anymore. War. Wind screaming down off the ridge with a violence that bent the pines flat, snow driving sideways in sheets that swallowed vision past 10 feet, which was exactly what Emmett had been waiting for. Because waiting was its own kind of torture, because every hour crouched in those rocks had given his mind too much room to run toward Rose, toward the valley, toward every version of tonight that ended wrong, until the storm finally hit its stride and gave him something better to do with the fear than simply hold it. Now, he breathed. Guyon nodded once. No words needed. 2 weeks of learning each other's rhythms had brought them here, to this moment, to a shared understanding that didn't require sentences anymore. They came down off the ridge low and fast, snow swallowing the sound of their approach, the cabin's stolen light flickering warm and wrong through the shuttered windows below. Emmett's chest was tight with something that wasn't quite fear, something closer to a held breath that had been building for 2 weeks, straight, finally about to release. His mind ran ragged the whole descent, because this was his cabin, because those were strangers sitting inside it, like it belonged to them, because somewhere in the last 2 weeks the word cabin had quietly become the word home again, and a man didn't hand over his home without a fight. Not this time, not after everything it had cost him to let it become one again. They split at the lean-to, Guyon toward the back window, silent as smoke. Emmett toward the front door, rifle steady despite the wind trying to tear it from his grip, inside a voice. Rough, careless, the way men got careless when they believed they'd already won. Storm's a mean one, it said. Colonel's soft, letting us sit pretty while he chases his own ghosts out there. A second voice, lower Coombs, the name Emmett would only learn later, from Briggs. Colonel wants it done clean. That's his business. Clean don't put money in my pocket any faster. Emmett's hand found the door latch, and the world came apart. He hit the door hard, shoulder first, rifle already swinging up as the frame splintered inward. One man, the closer one, half risen from his seat at Emmett's own table, went for his pistol. Wasn't fast enough. Each shot took him center mass. He went down, hard, table overturning, and the second man was already moving, diving for the cover of the hearth, gun coming up. Except Guyon was already there. Had come through the back window in the half-second of chaos. The gunshot bought her, knife in hand, moving with the same lethal economy she'd shown the wolf, and the second man's shot went wide and wrong, into the ceiling, before her blade found him. Silence after. Just the storm, howling outside walls that had, for one long terrible minute, belonged to somebody else. Emmett stood in the wreckage of his own front door, chest heaving, and looked at Guyon across the ruin of the room they'd built together over 2 weeks, the overturned table, the scattered supplies, 2 men who wouldn't be getting up again. You hurt, he said. Couldn't quite steady his voice. No. She was already moving, checking both men, confirming what neither of them wanted confirmed, but didn't it? You. No. Neither of them believed the calm in their own voices. Both kept it anyway because falling apart wasn't a luxury the night had left room for. Not yet. Because outside, past the wrecked door, past the howling snow, a third rider was still coming. Had to be. Briggs wouldn't have sent only 2 men to hold a cabin he cared this much about finding. Barricade the door, Emmett said. I'll take the back. They worked fast, silent, the storm's fury covering whatever sounds their hurried preparations made. Emmett dragged the overturned table against the shattered doorframe, jammed it tight, and was reaching for the shutter latch on the back window when the front door exploded inward anyway. Table and all, snow and wind pouring through in a white violent gust. A shape in the doorway, rifle already raised, a third man, younger than the other 2, face half hidden under a scarf, eyes wild with the particular recklessness of a man who'd just watched 2 friends go down and wanted, badly, to make somebody pay for it. Where is she? He said, voice cracking. Where's the Apache? He never finished the sentence. because Emmett had already thrown himself sideways into the path of the rifle swinging toward Nguyen, into the exact place a bullet meant for her was about to land instead. The shot took him high in the shoulder, spun him hard against the wall, breath torn from his lungs in one violent gasp, the world going white and then gray and then briefly, entirely black at the edges. He heard distantly another shot, heard the third man fall, heard his own name screamed from somewhere very far away. Emmett. He came back to himself on the floor of his own cabin, Nguyen's face inches from his, her hands already pressed hard against the wound. Blood, his blood, more of it than seemed reasonable, soaking dark through her fingers. "Stay with me," she said, voice cracking, for the first time since he'd known her. "Wasn't planning on you here. The one going anywhere." The words came out slurred, strange in his own ears. "Told you, not planning on being anywhere else." "Then prove it. Stay awake." He tried. The room kept sliding sideways, the fire's light smearing into long orange streaks across his vision. And somewhere underneath the pain, a thought kept surfacing and resurfacing, jagged and insistent, refusing to settle. Rose. This was how it happened for Rose too. Alone, calling a name nobody answered. Except he wasn't alone, except somebody was answering. Except the thought kept fracturing before he could finish it, kept circling back to the same terrified refrain. "Don't leave her the way you left her. Don't let this be the same story twice. Don't." He was distantly aware of her hands working fast and sure, tearing cloth, pressing, binding, every motion the same economical certainty she brought to everything. Except now her hands were shaking, actually shaking, in a way he'd never once seen from her. "You're crying," he managed. "I'm not." Terrible liar. He tried to smile. Wasn't sure it landed right. Didn't know that about you. "Shut up and stay awake, Emmett Calloway." "Bossy." "Alive," she said. "Fierce, desperate. I need you alive more than I need you quiet. So shut up and stay awake and let me work." He drifted after that, in and out, the cabin's walls swimming, her voice the only fixed point in a world gone loose at its moorings. He heard at some point the storm outside reach its full violent peak, heard at some other point hooves, more than one horse, approaching fast through the white chaos beyond the wrecked door. "Someone's coming," he managed. "I know." Her voice had gone hard egg and all the fear folded back down beneath something steadier, something ready. Stay down. Whatever happens, stay down." He didn't have the strength to argue. Lay there instead, blood warm and cold at once, and watched through slitted eyes as she rose to meet whatever was coming through that broken door, with a rifle in one hand and a fury in her face that could have stopped the storm itself by sheer will alone. The shape that filled the doorway a moment later wasn't a stranger. Silas Briggs. Alone, rifle lowered, held loose and unthreatening at his side, snow already thick on his shoulders. He took in the scene 2 dead men, an overturned table, Emmett bleeding on the floor, Nguyen standing over him with a rifle raised and steady, and something in his hard face went very still. "They weren't supposed to," he started. "They shot him," Nguyen said, flat furious. "Meant it for me." He put himself in front of it instead. "Where's Coombs? And the other one?" "Dead. Both of them, no apology in it. No hesitation either. Yours too out there in the snow, if you rode past him. Coming up." Briggs's jaw worked. Didn't answer that directly. "I told them to hold the cabin," he said. "Watch it. Wait for me. Nothing more." "Men with guns and grievances don't much stay patient," Nguyen said. "You should have known that before you sent them." "Should have." His voice was rough, raw around the edges. "Should have known plenty of things sooner than I did." Briggs's eyes moved to Emmett, to the blood soaking dark through improvised bandages, and something crossed his face that Emmett, even half-conscious, recognized. Recognition of a debt. The particular, specific weight of watching a man take a bullet for someone else, and understanding exactly what that meant and exactly what it cost. "Let me help," Briggs said. "Quiet. Why should I trust anything you?" "Because I've got no fight left in me tonight." His voice cracked, rough with something that had nothing to do with the cold. "Because I came up this ridge to end something, and instead I'm standing in a doorway watching a man bleed out for a woman he's decided is worth more than his own life, and that's..." He stopped. Swallowed hard. "That's not nothing, Miss Nguyen, whatever else I came here believing. Words are cheap, Colonel." "Not Colonel. Not anymore. Just a tired old man who's run out of reasons to keep pretending this hunt was ever about justice." He held her gaze. steady despite everything. Test me then. Let me prove it with my hands instead of my mouth. Nguyen studied him a long moment, rifle still steady, weighing a decision Emmett couldn't have made for her even if his strength had allowed it. Slowly she lowered the rifle. Then help, she said. Or get out of my way. What followed blurred for Emmett into fragments. Briggs's hands, surprisingly gentle, helping brace him upright. Nguyen's voice, sharp and certain, directing the work of stopping blood that didn't want to stop the storm outside. Finally beginning to ease, its fury spent against a night that had already taken everything it was going to take. He surfaced fully sometime near dawn, propped against the wall near the fire, the wound bound tight, weak but breathing, and found Briggs sitting across the ruined room, rifle set aside, staring into the flames with the hollow expression of a man who no longer entirely recognized the reasons he'd ridden up that mountain in the first place. You should hate me, Briggs said without looking up. For the valley, for everything that came after. I do, Emmett said, honest because he didn't have the strength left to be anything else. Some days, other days I just feel sorry for both of us. Two men who found different ways to carry the same kind of weight for far too many years, and neither one of us carried it well. Briggs's jaw tightened. I'm done hunting her. You should know that. Whatever paper trail exists on that killing near the agency, I'll see it buried, or explained, or however it needs handling. She defended her own life. That's the whole truth of it, and I should have seen that truth the first day instead of the 9th. Why now? Because I watched you take a bullet meant for her without a second's hesitation, Briggs said, and I understood, watching it, that whatever I'd convinced myself this hunt was about, it stopped being about justice a long while back, became about hating something simple enough to hate cleanly, because everything else about my boy's death was too complicated to hate at all. His voice broke, just slightly. I'm tired, Calloway. Tired of carrying it. Ready to set some of it down. Nguyen, kneeling beside Emmett, said nothing. But her hand found his, gripped tight, and Emmett understood, even exhausted, even bleeding, even uncertain if his shoulder would ever again pull a bowstring or split a log with the same ease that something had shifted in that cabin. Tonight that went beyond the storm, beyond the two men dead in the snow outside, beyond even the terrible relief of simply, impossibly, still being alive. There's something else, Emmett said, forcing the words out through the exhaustion dragging at him. Something I owe you both, owe the whole truth, not just the parts convenient to say. You already told me on the ridge, Nguyen said. The valley. Not all of it. He held her gaze, then Briggs's, gathering what strength remained. I've spent 16 years telling myself a scout only finds the path, that what happens at the end of it isn't his to carry. That's a lie, and I've known it's a lie for longer than I've let myself admit. I found that valley. I could have led that column, some sort, anywhere else. I chose the fastest trail because I wanted the mission over quick, wanted to get home to my wife, and I never once let myself weigh what that choice would cost the people camped at the end of it. The fire popped. Neither of them spoke. I'm not asking forgiveness, Emmett said. Don't think I've earned the right to ask that from either of you. Just wanted it said plain. Finally, after 16 years of saying it careful instead. Nguyen was quiet a long moment. Her hand didn't leave his. You could have kept that version to yourself, she said. The ridge version. Nobody in this room would have pushed you for more tonight, bleeding the way you are. Would have known it, though. Every day after that I told you the easy shape of it instead of the true one. His voice was weak, but the words came steady all the same. Rather bleed telling the truth than heal comfortable on a lie. That's a foolish way to nearly die, probably. A ghost of a smile. Seemed important at the time. Briggs shifted where he sat, jaw working, something clearly building behind the hard set of his face. I owe a confession too then, he said finally. Rough. Been telling myself for 10 years that hunting whoever I could find connected to that war was the same thing as honoring Daniel's memory. Wasn't. It was just hatred dressed up respectable. Man doesn't like admitting that about himself, especially just to the two people who paid the price for him not admitting it sooner. Why say it now? Nguyen asked. Because he did. Briggs nodded toward Emmett. Man bleeding out on his own floor found the courage to say the hard truth instead of the easy one. Seemed a poor showing on my part to stay silent after that. That's harder to hear than the version you gave me on the ridge, Nguyen said finally to Emmett. But it's honester. I'll take honester over easier every time. Briggs said nothing more, just nodded once, slow, and looked back into the fire like a man setting down, piece by piece, a weight he'd carried so long he'd nearly forgotten what walking without it felt like. News of that night traveled to town faster than any of them expected. Briggs saw to that himself, riding down at first light despite his own exhaustion. Determined, he said, to put the truth on record before anyone else could shape it into something uglier. He told it plain. A woman who'd defended her own life against a man who meant her harm. A rancher who'd nearly died shielding her from riders working outside any law worth respecting. A former colonel who'd hunted her on bad information and worse grief, and who was, as of that morning, formally closing the matter and saying so to anyone in town willing to listen. The marshal, a weathered man named Otis Reyes, who'd seen enough of the territory's ugliness to have grown tired of adding to it, listened to the whole account without interrupting once. "You're certain," he said finally. "Certain enough to put your own name on it, Colonel, not just hers." Certain, Briggs said. "Man doesn't ride 2 days on a bad conscience for anything less than certain. Then it's closed." Reyes wrote something final into his ledger, closed the cover. "Wouldn't have taken a woman's word alone on this, and that's an ugly truth about this territory I'm not proud to admit. But I'll take a colonel's, backed by hers. That's enough to close the file and mean it." Not everyone listened kindly. Emmett heard, weeks later, secondhand, that there'd been ugly words muttered in the saloon, ugly looks cast toward anyone who defended what Briggs had done. But the marshal took Briggs's word as final, official word, the kind that closed a file instead of opening a noose, and that in country that rarely offered people like Guyon anything close to justice at all was as much mercy as the territory was likely to grant. Emmett saw the ugliness firsthand once, in late January, when his shoulder had healed enough to a supply trip back into town. A man at the general store counter, older, weathered, looked Guyon up and down with open contempt and said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, that some men would let anything under their roof if it kept them warm at night. The room went silent, waiting to see what would happen. Emmett set his purchases down slow. "Deliberate, say that again," he said. "Quiet. Dangerous in its quiet." The man's bravado faltered under the look Emmett gave him, the same look he'd once turned on hostile riders in Apache country, the look of a man who had already survived worse than one bitter old fool and wasn't afraid to prove it twice in one afternoon. "Didn't mean nothing by it," the man muttered. "Meant every word of it, we both know that." Emmett didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "This is my wife. Going to be my wife, official. Come spring. You've got a problem with that. You can take it up with me directly, instead of muttering it sideways where you think I won't hear." Nobody in that store said another word the rest of the visit, but Guyon's hand found his on the ride home, held tight, and neither of them needed to say out loud what both already understood, that ugliness like that wasn't going to vanish overnight. Wasn't going to vanish, maybe ever completely, but it wasn't going to win either. Not against two people who'd already survived considerably worse than one bitter old man's contempt. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Some miles down the trail. I've heard worse. Learned long ago not to let it land." "Maybe you shouldn't have to keep learning that lesson," Emmett said. "Maybe it's past time somebody stood between you and it, instead of you always having to absorb it alone." She was quiet a moment. Then, softer than he expected, "Nobody's ever put themselves between me and it before. Not once. Get used to it," he said. Same words he'd told her once before in the rocks above the cabin, snowfall falling between them. "Told you already. Not planning on being anywhere else." Emmett's shoulder healed slow through a winter that stretched longer and harder than any he'd weathered alone. Guyon nursed it with the same fierce, practical competence she brought to everything, changing bandages, forcing broths and herbs down him on days he'd rather have simply slept through the pain, refusing, with a stubbornness that matched his own exactly, to let him die of something as small and survivable as a bullet after everything else they'd both survived to get here. He was, by his own admission, a terrible invalid. "Sit still," she told him more than once a day, most days, as he tried to rise and split wood one-handed against every piece of medical sense either of them possessed. "I'm fine. You're gray as ash and sweating through the effort of standing up. Man's got to be useful. Man's got to heal so he can be useful later instead of dead sooner." She'd push him back down onto the cot by the fire with a firmness that brooked no argument, and he'd grumble, and she'd ignore the grumbling entirely, and somewhere in that repeated small battle, A new rhythm took root between them, gentler than the one that had carried them through the siege, but no less real for its gentleness. She taught him, during those long housebound weeks, a few more words in her language, words for healing, for patience, for the particular kind of stubbornness that kept a wounded man arguing with his own nurse. He taught her, in turn, a card game he remembered from his army days, and she beat him at it, more often than pure chance should have allowed, which he suspected, though never proved, had something to do with the same sharp instincts that had once read deer sign off a broken twig from 30 paces. "You're cheating," he accused her, one particularly long February evening, watching her lay down a hand that emptied his own considerable pile of dried beans they'd taken to using as steaks. "I'm observant. Different thing entirely. Observant enough to know exactly which card I'm holding. You hold your cards the same way you hold your feelings, Emmett Calloway. Plain on your face for anyone paying attention. That's an insult. It's an observation. I told you. Different thing." Her mouth curved, warm and unguarded in the firelight, and he found himself, not for the first time that winter, simply watching her instead of minding the game at all. She caught him at it. Always caught him at it. "You're staring again." "Been informed I do that." Informed correctly. She set the cards aside, some unspoken agreement passing between them that the game was over for the night, replaced by something quieter, steadier, that needed no cards at all to keep either of them occupied. "You're a difficult patient," she told him one gray afternoon deep in February, changing the dressing with hands that had gone gentle, in ways he still wasn't fully used to. "You're a difficult nurse. Somebody has to be difficult enough to keep you alive." Her mouth curved, something warm, breaking through the exhaustion that had marked both their faces since that terrible night. "Man like you, left to his own devices, would have bled out quiet and called it dignity." "Would not have." "Would have." She tied off the bandage, sat back. "Good thing you're not left to your own devices anymore." By March, the wound had closed enough that he could split wood again, one-handed at first, then slowly, with both, the ache fading a little more each week, until it settled into something more memory than pain, a reminder, he supposed, that some scars were worth keeping, worth carrying forward as proof of exactly what a man was willing to risk for someone worth the risking. He looked at her a long moment, firelight catching the sharp planes of her face, softer now than they'd been that first night, though the sharpness hadn't gone anywhere. Had just found somewhere gentler to live Guyan. Her name plain, no other words attached yet. "What?" "That arrangement we made that first night." He held her gaze. "You said fair trade. Roof for wife's work. Nothing more unless we both said otherwise." Her breath caught, just slightly. "I remember saying otherwise." His voice was steady despite the effort it cost him. "Been meaning to say it plain for a while now. Kept finding reasons to wait, valleys and storms and bullets getting in the way. Say it now then. Quiet, steady, daring him the way she dared him that very first night, to answer plain or not at all. "I don't want a wife's work anymore," he said. "Want a wife. Want you. Not because of any bargain. Because of every single day since that bargain that's made me understand what I actually lost 4 years back, and what I might, impossibly, be getting a chance to find again." The fire crackled. Snow ticked soft against the shutters. Ordinary winter weather now. Nothing like the 2 storms that had marked the beginning and the breaking point of everything between them. "Say it plain, you," she said, echoing his own old rule back at him. Voice rough, used all the way plain. "I've had enough of careful I love you," he said. "No hedging left in it. Plain as that." She didn't answer with words at first. Just leaned in, careful, of his healing shoulder, and kissed him slow and sure, the way she did most things. And when she finally pulled back, there were tears standing bright in her eyes that she didn't bother pretending weren't there this time. "Full. I love you too," she said. "Plain as that. Been plain a while now. Just waiting on you to catch up." They were married that spring, once the passes cleared enough for travel. The first ceremony came at dawn, up near the ridge, where the snow had finally begun retreating from the high rocks. A small fire built the way Guyan's own people built such fires. Words spoken that belonged to her language and her tradition, and not to any telling Emmett would ever presume to explain fully to anyone who asked. He understood only pieces of it. Understood enough, though, to feel the weight of what was being promised, to feel it settle into his chest the way the valley's guilt once had. except this time the weight was one he welcomed carrying. She wore her mother's beadwork, salvaged years back from a bundle that had, impossibly, survived everything else that hadn't. Told him, quietly, the night before, that she'd never expected to wear it for anything but memory. Glad it's for more than memory now, he'd said. So am I. Her voice had caught just slightly. Didn't think I'd get a more after that valley. Didn't let myself hope for one. Got one anyway. Got one anyway, she'd agreed, and pulled him close. And neither of them said anything further that needed saying. Then a week later in town, before a circuit judge who'd heard the whole of Briggs's account and asked no further questions worth objecting to, they said the shorter, plainer words the territory required, words that felt, after the dawn fire on the ridge, almost unnecessary, though Emmett understood why she wanted both. One promise for her people. One promise for the world that would otherwise refuse to recognize the first. Silas Briggs stood witness at both. Said, afterward, that it was the first ceremony he'd smiled through, honestly, in 10 years. Summer found the cabin transformed, walls extended, a proper root cellar dug deep and dry. A garden turned into the black soil, where nothing but snow had sat the winter before. Duke shared the lean-to now with a second horse, a sturdy mare Guyon had traded for in town. And some evenings the two of them sat on a porch. Emmett had finally gotten around to building, watching the valley settle into long golden light, saying very little, because very little needed saying anymore. The town itself softened, slowly, the way hard ground softens after enough seasons of steady rain. Amos Whitfield, the blacksmith, rode out once that summer, unannounced, hat in his hands, and stood in the yard a long while before he found the words to say what he'd come to say. Been sitting wrong with me, he said, not quite meeting either of their eyes. What I did. Selling that information, he held out a small bundle, new horseshoes, unasked for, unpaid for, not much of an apology. It's what I've got to offer. Guyon studied him a long moment, then took the bundle. Wasn't only your fault, she said. Man came at you with money and a family to feed behind you. Doesn't make it right. Makes it understandable. Same as Emmett once told me about you. I can hold both those things at once. Amos nodded, throat working, and rode off without saying much more, but he came back again that fall, and the fall after that, and by the time a second winter had passed, nobody in that valley thought to comment much anymore on whose wife sat beside whose husband at the general store counter. Not everyone came around. Some hearts stayed hard the whole span of their lives, no matter what truth got set plainly in front of them. But enough did, slowly, one visit and one small kindness at a time, that the valley started to feel, for the first time in either of their lives, like something closer to a real home than either had dared hope for. Silas Briggs came by that same fall, riding up unannounced the way Amos had, though his purpose sat differently on him, lighter. Somehow, though the gray in his beard hadn't gone anywhere, and the lines in his face still carried the particular weight of a man who'd buried us too young, and spent a decade angry about it. Not staying long, he said, dismounting stiff in the yard. Wanted to see how it turned out. Turned out fine, Emmett said. Come in. Coffee's on. Briggs sat by the fire a while, quiet, watching Guyon move through the cabin with the same easy competence she'd shown from the very first week. And something in his face, Emmett noticed, had settled into something almost like peace. Been to the valley, Briggs said finally. Quiet. Your valley, he said to Guyon. Rode out there myself a month back. Stood where it happened. Said Daniel's name out loud to the wind. And hers, to your mother's, if you'd tell me it someday. Felt like something needed saying there finally, instead of just carried silent all these years. Guyon went very still. Why? Because grief kept private just festers, Briggs said. Learned that the hard way. Figured saying it out loud, in the place it happened, might finally let some of it. He looked into the fire. Didn't fix anything. Grief doesn't work like that, but it felt like a start. My mother's name was Naomi, Guyon said, used after a moment, voice softer than Emmett had heard it in a long while. Wasn't given easy to strangers in the old days. Giving it to you now, that's not nothing either. Briggs nodded, throat working, and didn't trust himself to answer that directly. He stayed through supper, told a few rough stories from his soldiering days that made even Guyon laugh once, unguarded, and rode out before full dark with a promise to visit again come spring. He kept that promise, and the one after it, until visits from the retired colonel became simply another thread in the valley's slow, ordinary weave of seasons proof. Emmett thought sometimes, watching him ride off into the gold evening light, that even the heaviest hatred could be set down, given enough time and enough courage to finally say the hard truth out loud, instead of carrying it silent. You ever miss it? Nguyen asked. One such evening, months later, the fire behind them banked low against a night that held nothing but ordinary, welcome cold, the solitude. Before all this, no, he didn't have to think about the answer. Solitude wasn't peace, just felt like peace because I'd stopped expecting anything better. And now I expect plenty. He reached over, found her hand, laced his fingers through hers. Expect supper that tastes like something. Expect an argument about the stove damper at least once a week. Expect a wife smarter and tougher than I deserve, who walked through my door in a blizzard and told me exactly what she needed without once asking permission to need it. She laughed, soft and real, a sound that had become as familiar to that cabin now as the fire's own crackle. You need a wife, she said, echoing the words from a night that felt now both impossibly far away and close enough to touch. And I need a roof. Had that backward, he said. Turns out I needed you a good deal more than I needed the roof. Roof was just the excuse. Was it an excuse? Best one I ever built with my own 2 hands. He looked at her, at the home they'd made from 2 separate griefs and one honest reckoning, and understood, moved with a certainty that had nothing left in it of doubt, exactly what a roof was actually for. Not just keeping weather out. Keeping 2 people close enough, long enough for something real to grow in the space between them. She rested her head against his good shoulder, watching the last light fade purple and gold over the ridge, where a fire had once burned for a marriage neither the government nor half the territory had wanted to recognize, and where, months before that, 2 riders had once sat waiting in ambush, and where, before even that, a young scout had once found a trail he'd wished, every day since, he'd never found at all. The valley held all of it now. The grief and the guilt, the wolves and the wedding, the bullet and the healing that followed. Held it the way good land always holds what's been given to it, without judgment, without forgetting, simply carrying forward whatever gets planted, season after season, until something worth keeping finally takes root. Emmett. Thanks, she said, quiet, plain, the way she said the things that mattered most. For staying. For saying the hard truth instead of the easy one. For teaching me that home could mean something besides just a roof to survive under. Thank you, he said back, for knocking on that door in the first place. For refusing to let me keep hiding behind 4 years of splitting wood and calling it living. We were both hiding back then. Weren't hiding anymore by the end of it. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, neither one of us. The fire popped low behind them, somewhere out past the valley. An owl called once into the dark and went quiet. And Emmett Calloway, cattle rancher, widower, reluctant host to a storm that had changed absolutely everything, pulled his wife closer against the cooling evening air and understood, finally fully, what 4 winters of solitude had never once managed to teach him. That a house built only to survive in was never the same thing as a home. And a man only ever found the difference once somebody walked through his door and refused to let him keep pretending otherwise.